interest and importance of the subject. While various initiatives have been taken by the industry as well as by the government in terms of compliance, or in terms of even raising the concerns and the issues around the regulation, but there is a lot more that needs to be done, both in terms of transition, both in terms of bilateral and multilateral discussions and negotiations, in terms of technology that needs to be adopted, in terms of various monitoring parameters and reporting parameters. A lot of things needs to be taken forward, and therefore we conceived this program as one of the series where we will have discussions in terms of the CBAM. So today's program is more in terms of the industry discussion, wherein how the industry is taking this regulation forward, what kind of technologies they are adopting. The next in the series would be in terms of a dialogue with the European counterparts, which will also be held very soon. So, what FICCI has done is it has taken this initiative of organizing series of programs on the subject. While in the last one which we organized was more in terms of spreading awareness and on in terms of the various basic features of the CBAM regulation. But now we have entered into that phase where we are talking about that how we shall move forward and how we shall navigate this regulation, this global regulation moving ahead. So this one, as I mentioned, would be more in terms of the industry discussion, while the other one, the next one, which would be following very soon, and we will share the dates with you pretty soon, which would be in terms of a dialogue between the Indian and the European counterparts, both in terms of the government as well as in terms of the industry. Without much ado and without taking too much of time, I would now request our opening speaker, Shri Vinod Gupta ji, who is a senior member of FICCI Steel Committee and also the ED Commercial at Steel Authority of India Limited, for his opening remarks and do the context setting as well. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Arpan. Very good afternoon to all of you. Distinguished guests, fellow industry leaders, policymakers, and colleagues. I'm honored to address you all and share a perspective at this timely and crucial session on CBAM. I would like to begin by thanking FICCI for taking this important initiative and organizing today's program. It provides an invaluable platform for dialogue between government, industry, and global partners on a subject that is both urgent and highly strategic. The European Union Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism (CBAM) is being projected as a landmark policy shift aimed at aligning trade with climate goals. By placing a carbon price on imports of emissions-intensive goods, CBAM is promoted as a tool to prevent carbon leakage and promote cleaner industrial production globally. However, from the perspective of a developing country, there are more nuances to this. While not denying the necessity for stopping global warming, it must be recognized that a major proportion of emissions were historically created by nations presently classified as developed. The form in which CBAM is presently implemented is not in keeping with the agreed principles of CBDR, that is common but differentiated responsibilities, and also the principles of polluter pays. Many developing nations face a crisis of resource allocation between urgent priorities such as health, care, water, food, security, etc. And in its present form, CBAM is likely to turn into an unfair trade regulation tilted against them. In its current transitional phase, CBAM targets sectors such as steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizers, hydrogen, and electricity industries that are central to both Indian economy and employment and trade competitiveness. From point of view of trade with the European Union, steel and aluminium constitute the significant impacted sectors. For India, where these sectors form the backbone of manufacturing exports, CBAM introduces both disruption and opportunity. India's steel sector, from integrated players to MSMEs, is facing one of the most transformative regulatory shifts in global trade. Our perspective is crucial because we are not simply observers of CBAM. We are the entities that must operationalize compliance, invest in decarbonization, and maintain global competitiveness while adopting to this mechanism. From an industry standpoint, the initial reaction to CBAM has been one of both concern and resolve. In view of India's commitments at the multilateral COP forum, large integrated players like SAIL, Tata, JSPL, and JSW had begun strategic planning and investments in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and alternative fuels. We see decarbonization not merely as a compliance issue, but as a potential competitive differentiator. A unilateral CBAM, however, has pushed and accelerated an acceleration which many developing countries may neither have envisaged nor be prepared for. The concern is strengthened by the fact that this acceleration is coming at a time when there are at present no alternative steelmaking technologies which are viable on the commercial scale. Availability of scrap, a low carbon footprint resource, is not only insufficient but is further restricted by various measures, including the EU waste shipment regulation. The lack of alternative steelmaking technologies and insufficient scrap means that required capacity expansions are largely driven by blast furnace route, which inherently has higher emissions footprints. Steelmaking facilities have extended service lives of nearly 30 to 40 years, which further complicates matter for developing countries. Even in case of India, our secondary steel sector, accounting for nearly 40% of national production and largely MSME driven, faces disproportionate challenges due to limited resources and technological gaps. These MSMEs face serious financial, technological, and compliance barriers to meet CBAM's rigorous monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements. This uneven readiness is a concern for the broader ecosystem and requires urgent capacity building. The economic complications are considerable. CBAM could add a 20 to 35% tax burden on Indian steel exports to the EU. Indian steel exports to the EU, which account for 25% of our total exports, could face duties in the range of 102 to 190 US dollars per ton over the next decade. Moreover, EU safeguard measures, including tightened quotas and 25% duties on excess shipments, create a dual challenge in combination with CBAM that could further reduce India's market share in Europe. India's steel emission intensity is currently 2.5 tons of CO2 equivalent per ton of crude steel, compared to global average of 1.91 tons CO2 equivalent per ton. While we have made substantial progress reducing emissions from 3.1 tons CO2 equivalent in 2005, there is more to achieve. Steel currently contributes around 12% of India's total CO2 emissions. So our sector's response to CBAM will critically influence India's path to its 2070 net zero goal. In the meantime, near-term measures are accelerating. Across the industry, we are seeing a shift towards CCUS, that is carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Renewable energy adoption, including exploring fuels like green hydrogen and scrap-based electric arc furnaces production, all of which lower carbon intensity. These actions reflect the proactive mindset of Indian steel producers. We are committed to tangible reduction today while preparing for a broader transition to green steel. Reflecting the country's approach to the decarbonization, speaking at the 26th Conference of Parties, COP26 in Glasgow, our Honorable Prime Minister, Shri Narendra Modi, announced that India will achieve net zero emissions by 2070. The PM also announced that India will raise its non-fossil energy capacity to 500 gigawatts by 2030, while meeting 50% of its energy demand through renewables. As of June 25, renewable energy constitutes 49% of India's total generation capacity of 476 gigawatt. The world's largest renewable energy installation is being commissioned at Khavda in the state of Gujarat in the Kutch region, which will generate 30 gigawatts of renewable power by 29. The CBAM challenge poses concerns for us, not only in terms of erosion of our hard-earned market share in EU, but also the threat of cheap imports of surplus steel from other countries to India. It is important for the country to ensure that other nations exporting to the EU and facing similar challenges are not able to route their exports to India, especially under FTAs, and capture the domestic demand. The domestic manufacturers should be provided with a level playing field against all these challenges. This therefore demands a whole of industry response and collaboration between industry, government, finance, and technology providers, voicing our concerns while simultaneously transiting towards green. Once again, I thank FICCI for organizing this timely and valuable platform. This enables much needed industry policy dialogue, helping shape India's strategic response to CBAM. Together, we will not only safeguard the global competitiveness of Indian steel, but also position ourselves as leaders in sustainable low carbon manufacturing worldwide. Let us work together to build a resilient, competitive, and environmentally responsible Indian sector. The challenges posed by CBAM are significant, but together we can withstand this transition. Our steel industry has a history of resilience and adaptability, and we must draw on these strengths to navigate this new landscape successfully. I'm happy to note that this technical sessions to follow will highlight the various requirements of CBAM, how prepared are Indian producers, and what needs to be done, both at the government and the industry level. I wish everyone a productive day of discussions and actionable outcomes for India's green transition. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for highlighting the industry concerns and a comprehensive industry perspective on the regulation, and also in terms of how, in terms of numbers, it can impact us in terms of the duties and the kind of exports percentage that we have to the EU. I think it has set the tone of the entire webinar in a very fruitful manner. Moving on, we have another senior member from 50 Steel Committee, Shri Sanjay Singh ji, who is the senior, who is the director for strategy and external relations at Jindal Steel, and he is the former secretary, Government of India for Steel as well. So he will bring a perspective from both the sides. Over to you, sir, for a very comprehensive and detailed analysis from the industry side.
Thank you, Arpan. In the beginning, Vinod Gupta ji has elaborated on the subject of that how difficult and what path we have to take in time to come towards implementing CBAM. So namaskar to all the participants, all the panel members who are in this webinar. As has been highlighted by Gupta ji, steel is hard to abate sector. And further, it is categorized into two genres. One is ISP, the bigger player, and the other is MSMEs. Things are more complex to implement CBAM for the MSMEs. When we have a look at exports, which Indian steel sector is making to Europe, overall, we have been exporting 5 to 6% of our total produce world over. In last few years, 2-3 years, this export has come down to 3 to 4%, and last year it was less than 4%. Out of that, in terms of number, it was in the vicinity of 5 to 6 million tons. Out of that, 25% goes to Europe. But despite that, in terms of CBAM coverage, when we have a look at the exports which are going into Europe, steel is the largest sector. And when we look at the impact which this kind of taxation is going to have on the steel sector, it would be to the tune of around, if things are as they are right now, around 25%. So in this kind of a background where steel sector, hard to abate sector, and there are challenges on technology front, technology towards full decarbonization does not exist. Or rather, if I can say, if at all exists, it is not exists in an implementable form, economically viable form. Then we have large number of blast furnaces, and a lot of blast furnaces are also in the process of being set up. So there is long-term carbon locking. Indian government had been discussing with the European counterparts that there should be some kind of phasing in implementation of CBAM. Right now, they have a uniform kind of architecture for everybody. So if this architecture could be segregated in terms of a country like ours, and where there are MSMEs, there are larger players, and also in the and where there is no scrap, and the mainstream route of steel making is blast furnaces. So basically, task is not easy, but it is negotiable. CBAM, I mean, as has been mentioned by Arpan and Gupta ji as well, is essentially an accounting and reporting format. This accounting and reporting mechanism, I mean, that something has to happen in the background from which the data would come and that would be recorded here. I mean, that is the decarbonization measures. So all the decarbonization measures which would be happening, they are to be recorded, reported, and analyzed and put up in a manner which is amenable according to Europe's regulations. Right now, there are a couple of levers which have been put in place and which are going to play a very, very important role in negotiating CBAM implementation in India. One very important aspect is that SEBI has come out, last year it has come out with BRSR core reporting for the top industries. BRSR is Business Responsibility Sustainable Reporting, which is part of the annual report of every company. So BRSR core is a level up, a level above than the BRSR. So what does it entail? It says that every company has to report its sustainability, or you may say ESG, efforts that it has made during the year. And towards that, a kind of mechanism is required to be set up for data collection. A kind of a system is required toward data management. I mean, and in fact, entire MRV kind of system which is there for right now for CBAM, I mean, that has to be put in place through BRSR. But BRSR is different from CBAM in terms of intensity. CBAM requires more granular data. It requires data right from whatever emission scope 1 and scope 2 is happening, right from the raw material stage to transport stage to different stages of production and so on. And it is basically product wise embedded emission is to be recorded through CBAM, product wise as well as process wise. That's why it becomes slightly different from BRSR reporting. But nevertheless, once a company has set up a system towards BRSR reporting, then it would be in a position to uplift it, take it forward to the level of CBAM quite simply, quite easily. But the problem is for those who are not within the ambit of BRSR core reporting. I'm talking about the MSME sector. Because BRSR reporting is happening only for the top 1,000 companies, which are there for in terms of carbon in market cap. So they will be easily able to transition, and they are doing a lot of steps have been taken by the largest steel makers towards decarbonization. For instance, I can say about Jindal Steel. I mean, there is a very big thirst on renewable energy. Around 3 gigawatt of capacity is being set up. The capacity for production of green hydrogen is being set up, and we are pioneer in coal gasification. So all these, and along with that, even CCUS. I mean, we are piloting certain projects with IITs towards CCUS. But in terms of CBAM infrastructure to be put in place, larger steel players would be able to do it with some effort in time to come. But their main issue is going to be how to decarbonize steel. CBAM is only, as I mentioned, is a reporting and accounting architecture, but essentially decarbonization has to happen. How much embedded carbon footprints are there in the product? I mean, that has to be reduced. So in this kind of a system which we have in place, another very important lever which in time to come is going to be very, very important is CCTS. I mean, that is carbon credit trading system, which is a mechanism to create carbon market. So this is a measure which is going to be quite helpful, is going to aid hard to abate sector. What does it essentially would be doing for the hard to abate sector? Whatever effort these companies would be making, smaller or bigger, towards carbon dioxide reduction and mitigation, they would be credit for that, meaning thereby that what money is being put in this effort, it would be able to generate certain revenue. And those revenues, once the European carbon market and our carbon market are harmonized, so then I mean those credit would be able to be transferred to the European or CBAM kind of a ecosystem as well. So CCTS to me is very important. But overall, what I'll say, smaller sector MSMEs require capacity to be built. Capacity, not only the human resource capacity, the management capacity to manage CBAM or this kind of a system, as well as setting up system toward digitalization, setting up a system towards monitoring, reporting, and verification, because under CBM, verification plays a very, very key role, very, very important role. Though it is also there in BRSR, but that is at a very, very lighter level. Here it is validation, verification by an agency which is accredited by EU. So that is going to be very important. So we have to really work towards so that our goods are able to be exported to European market. Otherwise, a couple of days back, we saw that there was the FTA has been signed with Indian FTA with UK. And UK is also in line. They are going to have another kind of CBAM from 1 year later, from 2027. So FTA benefit would not accrue to us unless we are able to align our product specification to the European or the UK standards, meaning thereby that whatever what are the carbon emission levels are, they have to be aligned. So otherwise FTA would become dysfunctional and would not give us those kind of benefits. So we have to work towards decarbonization, number one. Secondly, creating capacity, especially for the MSME sector. In this regard, FICCI can play a very, very important role. And capacity towards creating architecture, capacity towards strengthening their human resource base, their administration system, and so on. I mean, these were the couple of things which I thought, which I wanted to bring out here. I mean, this is all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you for highlighting on the need for granular data, both product-wise as well as process-wise, and on customized approach to be adopted nation-wise, and particularly the challenges that the MSME segment, which is a very, very important segment of our Indian steel industry, will face or is facing in terms of the CBAM compliance. So very, very important points has been highlighted by sir. When we are talking about carbon, when we are talking about carbon capture and carbon mechanisms, how can we not have a speaker from the BEE? So therefore, I welcome the director from BEE, Shri Arijit Sen Gupta ji, who has been a veteran on the carbon markets and carbon pricing, carbon captures, carbon mechanisms. And I request for his address to the gathering out here.
Thank you, Arpanji. Respected delegates, ladies and gentlemen. So, as Sir just mentioned a while back, that the tools that the government of India has come up with to support the decarbonization journey of the Indian industry. One is, of course, BRSR of reporting of SEBI, which Sir just mentioned. And the other one is the carbon credit trading scheme, which I will be talking about. Before I go into the carbon credit nuances of the carbon credit trading scheme and how is it going to facilitate the CBAM regulation of the industry. Of course, we are all aware that the two major sectors that are going to be impacted with the CBAM, which are the highly exporting sectors, are steel and aluminium. So we have already heard about the kind of impact that it will have on steel industry. Similarly, as far as aluminum industry is concerned, as per our preliminary assessment, due to the high carbon intensive nature of the aluminum sector, the aluminum sector might also be impacted almost like 40% of its input cost. This being the case, when we say that aluminum sector in India is one of the most efficient among the industrial sector, but because of the technology lock-in, because of the coal-based power generation that we rely on, we have to we are going to pay some price in order to comply for the CBAM thing. But I think nevertheless, these are the two sectors which, for the time being, will be discussing more about when we are talking about the CBAM thing. But there are other energy intensive sectors as well who may not be impacted as highly as this, but the high energy intensive sectors, whoever is exporting into the EU, they will also be impacted in some form or the other. So, as per the direction of the government and of course, in line with our international commitments to become net zero by 2070, the government of India has come up with this carbon credit trading scheme. And I think most of you will be aware that already the draft notifications under the Environment Protection Act have already been issued for public consultation. So initially, the draft notification was published for 4 sectors, which were cement, wood alkali, paper, and aluminium. And now the other 4 energy intensive sectors, that is steel, petrochemicals, refinery, and textile, are also out. So essentially, these are the 8 sectors which are kind of transitioning from our erstwhile Perform, Achieve, and Trade scheme to the carbon credit trading mechanism. And I think the timing would not have been much more appropriate, keeping in view the kind of accounting, reporting, and verification that we need for compliance under the CBAM. I think the carbon credit trading scheme, the CCTS scheme, provides the opportunity for the industry to also develop a robust accounting, reporting, verification system, and which can actually help them in the future to go to meet the requirements of the EU regulations as well. Similarly, when we're talking about accounting, reporting, and verification, it's important that we do not lose our focus on decarbonization. And that is exactly what we are trying to aim at when we're talking about the CCTS scheme. So if we look at our Perform, Achieve, and Trade scheme, wherein most of the industries have partnered with us, and of course we are thankful to all the industries for your active support and active role that you have played, which had actually helped us in the successful completion of this now 7 cycles of the Perform, Achieve, and Trade scheme. So in the PAT scheme, our target was in terms of reducing the specific energy consumption. And in the CCTS scheme, what we are targeting is to reduce the GEI, that is the greenhouse gas emission intensity. So India, of course, being a developing country, we always talk in terms of reducing our emission intensity and not the absolute emissions, because of course the absolute emissions will increase, be it the industry sector or be it the services sector or other sectors. But what we are trying to achieve is how to reduce the emission intensity, that is the emission per unit of production of that sector. So in line with that, we have, with the active support of the industry, we have been able to now formally kind of assign targets to individual units in all these 8 energy intensive sectors that I just mentioned. And hopefully the scheme will be rolled out in the next 2-4 months when finally the targets will be notified. And then the cycle of the scheme will start. And also, as Sir just mentioned a while back, that one of the important feature of the scheme is also the trading part. So that was also unique in case of our earlier Perform, Achieve, and Trade scheme, wherein we are trying to incentivize those units which will be able to overachieve the assigned targets. And also the understanding is that they will be able to leverage some of the investment that they had made in order to overachieve those targets. So through the trading mechanism. So that is also very much, and we hope that by December next year, we will also be able to like have the first trading cycle in place. So with this is the broad thing I would like to highlight about the contours of the carbon credit trading scheme. Of course, now that the notifications are there in the public domain, I think all the industries are aware about it. And so I do kind of would like to thank FICCI for organizing this seminar, for dealing with how the industries need to deal with CBAM. So just before I kind of stop, just like to give 2 or 3 suggestions regarding the kind we have. I've seen that in the agenda we have 2 very engrossing technical sessions coming up. I hope that the speakers will address the issues related to CBAM which the industries are facing. More importantly, maybe we can also think of exploring the potential economic implications and trade disruption that may happen for the non-EU countries. So the discussions can focus on that. Similarly, I will also request if the discussions can also focus on addressing concerns about the fairness and equity in the application of CBAM to countries which have varying levels of economic development and climate commitments. So we understand this huge gap that is there between developed countries and the developing countries. And I mean, as India, we always use this narrative in most of our global discourse. And the third last thing that I would like to kind of highlight is we also need to discuss the mechanisms that will ensure that CBAM does not only unfairly penalize the countries with less stringent or different climate policies. So these are the food for thought that I just wanted to leave everyone with. And once again, thank you very much, FICCI, for giving us the opportunity to share our views and look forward to the discussions in the next sessions. Thank you very much.
Sure, thank you, sir. On behalf of the entire industry, would like to thank you and BE for supporting in their transition towards green, especially with the schemes like PAT and CCTS, and for beautifully explaining how we are transiting from PAT to the CCTS. What are the difference between the two? Also, very well rightly pointed out, sir, that the 3 points at the end, that in terms of economic implications, in terms of fairness and equity, when we are dealing with the CBAM, and also in terms that no country should be penalized or no exporter should be penalized for the processes that they have been carrying for so long. So I think the very valid 3 points highlighted, which will guide the discussions from here on for the next 2.5 hours of this particular webinar. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts on the important subject. May I now request Dr. James? May I now request Dr. James, who is a professor and head at Center for Trade and Investment Law, to share a perspective on the global trade in terms of how we are looking at this CBAM, in terms of regulations, in terms of exports, in terms of trade, and also in terms of the investments. Over to you, Dr. James, and thank you so much for joining us today.
So good afternoon, Mr. Arpin, and thank you, FICCI, and for all the distinguished delegates for their very valuable inputs in this opening session. So my name is James Nedumbar. I am heading the Center for Trade and Investment Law, which is helping the Department of Commerce in relation to international trade matters. So in fact, the discussion on CBAM, has actually been there for a fairly long time. Even many people said that. I mean, I'm talking from the point of view of economists who argued that carbon tax or carbon pricing is actually one of the preferred ways of dealing with climate change. And when you really look at the European Union CBAM measure, it is actually one of the first measures taken by a country in order to come up with a regulation, in order to reduce the carbon emission or the carbon intensity in the production process. This is actually a very highly contentious matter. So in the international trade law circles, many people argued that it is a complete violation of the international trade agreements to which the European Union is a party. Basically, the assumption is that, in international trade law, no country can actually differentiate products based upon the production process. unless that production process has got some kind of an influence on the product characteristic per se. And here again, I think there is a larger issue whether one country can actually impose a tax on a carbon emitted in a foreign country. So these are again very interesting debates which have been happening for a fairly long period of time. So in the context of the European Union, we should also admit the fact that the European Union has got a measure which is the European Trading Scheme from 2005 onwards. And they have been taking internal measures with respect to reducing the carbon intensity in several sectors. But this initiative actually received the impetus way back in 2015 when the United Nations adopted the UN SDG goals. And we know that the UN SDG goals will have to be met by the 2030 target. So another interesting point is that they also came up with something called the Fit for 55, which is actually part of the European Green Deal mechanism as well. They want to reduce the carbon intensity by 55% by 2030 when compared to the 1990 levels. So these are all laudable objectives for that matter, because we know that climate change is actually real and some measures are really called for. But when we really look at this particular measure, I think the European Union may argue that they have only focused 6 most important energy intensive sectors, which includes the iron and steel, the fertilizer sector, the cement, electricity, and hydrogen. There may not be much of a dispute with respect to the carbon intensity of these measures. But a lot of people actually believe that this is an environmental regulation for protectionism. And there are certain valuable grounds for doubting the bona fides of the European Union regulation as well. In the sense that this measure, if you really go through the European regulation, it actually states in multiple places that their main concern seems to be carbon leakage. So carbon leakage in the sense that the industries from Europe going to other locations where there is a lax or inefficient regulation of environmental externalities. So our center had also done quite a few studies in this particular matter. We had done a major work with the PricewaterhouseCoopers as well. So generally the feeling is that among many countries, some of the developing countries, or you can say the emerging economies, will bear the brunt of this particular regulation. And for a fairly long time, it was assumed that India, Mexico, China, Turkey, and Brazil included. These are the 5 countries which are likely to bear the brunt of this particular regulation. So we also did a study in association with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and based upon the various scenarios, because we know that the carbon price is not actually a stable one. It basically varies across time. Sometimes it can be 80 euros, sometimes it can go even maybe up to 120 euros per metric ton. So what could be the impact of this measure on the industry? Even based upon some conservative estimates, we found that on the steel sector, it could be in the region of minimum 20 to 25%, whereas in the case of aluminum, it could be in the range of 15%. So slightly lower impact on the aluminum sector. So now what can be done? We know that the CBAM has actually become a reality. We are now in the transition phase of the CBAM regulation. So what can be done in order to mitigate the impact of the industry? So my own feeling is that the European Union is also trying to do some kind of an experimentation. This is again in the trial phase. And I do not think that the European Union will come up with a very rigid approach in relation to implementing this particular matter, because now we have got the transitional phase, which will get over very soon, and then the definitive phase will start. But even in the definitive space, my feeling is that the European Union will be compelled, because of various other factors, to make some kind of a tweaking to their own CBAM regulation. Sometimes the motivation may not come from the pressure exerted by other countries, because the European Union industry will also have to comply with this kind of regulation. And there's already some kind of a backlash within Europe in order to reduce the intensity of these regulatory mechanisms they have. And we also know that now the European Union and the US have actually signed some kind of a trade agreement very recently, day before yesterday. And sometimes it will also, in a way, push back the kind of decarbonization initiatives they have taken. So what can be done by countries including India from a policy perspective? So as I mentioned earlier, the European Union has got the habit of coming up with various implementing regulations. And these implementing regulations can actually reduce the tone and tenor of the compliance burden on the third parties. So I think India should actually use all channels of negotiation diplomacy and even the opportunities within the trade negotiation in order to compel and convey the point that this measure is actually an unfair measure. And this is again something which I think most of the people are familiar with. Even when countries actually joined the Paris Agreement of 2015, there is a general obligation to reduce or limit the carbon dioxide, what you call as the temperature rise within 1.5 degrees when compared to the pre-industrial levels. But even this within this particular mechanism, there is a general obligation for common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So if you really want to actually respect your international obligation, one way is to provide a long transition, I think, a period for exporters from developing countries, especially for small and medium enterprises. So I think this is an option which India has, and India is definitely using it at this particular point of time as well. The second is again a point which many speakers before me have also highlighted. The major challenge is basically the MRV, the monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements. First of all, let me tell you, I'm a lawyer. I find it very difficult to actually go through their original regulation and the periodic implemented regulations they come up from time to time. It requires significant amount of expertise, understanding of the European system, and then business acumen in order to comply with these regulations. So, I mean, it is absolutely essential that they will have to make these processes much more, flexible and less rigid for that matter. The second thing is that they have also come up with a simplified mechanisms, mechanisms which is supposed to benefit the micro, small, and medium enterprises. But in our experience of interacting with the industry, it is not actually going to help the small and medium enterprise from countries like India. It is only a provision given to some of the small importers within the European Union. So the practical effect of the measure is next to nothing. So this is one area I think where I think we had to use our diplomatic, strength and opportunity in order to convey this position clearly to the European Union that this simplified procedure or the de minimis provisions which they have come up with is not going to serve the position of the small and medium enterprises. So many speakers of this particular webinar, including Mr. Sanjay Singh, mentioned that decarbonization is actually the goal. And every country has got certain types of decarbonization goal. We have got a 2070 goal, whereas the European Union has got a 2050 goal for that matter. But one important point is that these decarbonization goals, including the development of the CCTS, will not actually become fruitful until we have got some kind of a carbon price parity. So assuming that the carbon price in India is actually $10 per metric ton, whereas in the European Union it is going to be 100 euros per metric ton, we can never actually see it. So that is why we need to have a fair mechanism. We need to have a fair carbon pricing mechanism to make sure that the processes and the steps taken by a country in order to mitigate the impact of carbon emission is adequately recognized in the European Union. And I think we have got an ongoing bilateral FTA with the European Union as well. This point can be, and is actually being negotiated with them. This point has to be amplified. The second is, again, I think this is also an opportunity. So India is, again, of course, we have got, legacy plants and other things, but again, this is an opportunity for the country to make a swifter transition. So some of the bigger companies, as I understand from this webinar, they have already made the transition, or maybe they are actually in the path of making that particular transition. But again, India is such a big country, the challenges will have to be taken up by the concerned ministries and government departments and by the firms themselves in order to actually reach the decarbonization goal. Let me also, conclude by saying that now, I mean, globally speaking, CBAMs or carbon pricing mechanisms or carbon tax mechanism is actually becoming the norm. So there is also a reference to the UK CBAM, which is going to come into effect in 2027. Norway or the EFTA countries have already come in with a mechanism. There are proposals happening in Australia. Even in the United States, there are some proposals in order to bring in a CBAM. So I think maybe CBAM is an idea whose time has come, which we may have to recognize at the same time. But at the same time, we have to really negotiate with these countries and make sure that the impact on the industry is actually much lower. I would like to recall, the observation of an International Court of Justice Tribunal, which provided an advisory opinion very recently. And they said that to meet the 1.5 degree centigrade target is actually a binding obligation for the countries. So now it may give an impetus to many countries who may be implementing CBAM kind measures to argue that we really need them in order to meet the decarbonization goals. So I think we need a lot of, I think, individual efforts, firm level efforts, and at the same time, initiative from the government in order to negotiate tough with these countries. But at the same time, we have to also change internally. And I think that is a message I would like to convey in this very important meeting. I would like to thank Vicky for a very timely discussion and would like to convey my gratitude for being invited. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. James. It is really a pleasure to have you with us and to hear from you, specifically kind of a comprehensive perspective that you have shared in terms of the importance of negotiations, then also in terms of the challenges that even the simplified procedures for CBAM may have, and we may not be able to really take move forward in terms of even after the simplified CBAM, and also as you mentioned that the MRV requirements and all those things are very important when we are moving forward. So. And how other countries are following suit in terms of whether it is UK CBAM or the other countries, the Norways, and are coming up, which could open another set of challenges for the global trade for the steel and aluminum sector. So thank you so much for sharing a very comprehensive and detailed perspective. This has set the tone for the discussion, especially in the technical session too, wherein we have diversified speakers from different segments or stakeholders of the CBAM regulation. So thank you so much for your participation and joining us today here, sir. Dr. Shri Ashwani Kumar ji is in a meeting and he would be joining us at around 4 p.m. So may I now request Shri Pankaj Satija, who is the co-chair for FICCI Mining Committee and senior member FICCI Steel Committee, to have the concluding remarks and proposed vote of thanks for our speakers of the opening session. Over to you, Pankaj sir.
Yeah, good afternoon everyone. By listening to all the speakers, what has come to my mind that it reminds me of a story also. That once upon a time, a person was going to his maternal uncle. And on the way to the village, he saw one forest area. There were a lot many parrots on the trees, and he got hold of one parrot, took his home, put it in the cage, and continued for say 2-3 months. He again got an opportunity to visit his maternal uncle. And while going, he talked to the parrot that I am going to my maternal uncle and I may meet some of your friends and family members. If you have anything to convey, please tell me. So while going, he saw again parrots on the trees and he started conveying the message of the parrots to all the parrots. Many of them were in the groups and they all sympathized. Yes, it is very sad that he's in the cage. But one of the parrot was lone. So he went to him also and then told that one of your friends is in the cage and he has conveyed this message. After listening, this parrot collapsed. And this man also felt very bad that what sort of friendship he had. And while listening, he collapsed. He came back and narrated the story to the parrot who was in the cage. And listening to the story, this parrot also collapsed. This man was in utter confusion. He opened the cage, took the parrot out, and then the parrot flew. He told that while others were sympathizing with me, that was only true friend who told me how to come out of the situation. And probably this CBAM webinar, people are expecting that we may sympathize with aluminum or steel production or export going down, or the tax regime, what it is going to come. But we all are looking for those solutions which the parrot gave to his fellow parrot. With that note, I would like to thank everyone who has spoken earlier. And there are many common lines which almost everyone has agreed that the CBAM was fit for 55 package, which was to reduce the GHG emission by 55% by 2030 related to 1990 level. Everyone has spoken that major sectors are cement, steel, aluminum, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. Everyone also spoke on that it is not fair. The carbon pricing in India versus Europe is different, 10:100. The different phase were also spoken about. Transitional phase October 23 to December 25, and definite phase which is January 26. So the webinar is happening at the appropriate time, which will definitely give a lot of insights to all the participants, and they will take it to their own industry. But the data also, if you see the exports before this even actually comes to the definitive phase, exports in 2024 compared to 2022, steel and steel products exports have declined by 21%, while aluminum exports also reduced by 19%. There are certain common threat also which spoken by different members, that the publication of revised default value should be there, and who will be verifying the criteria of accredited verifiers. So these were the common threads among all the speakers, the common point. And I like to thank all the speakers. Mr. Vinod Gupta, he highlighted on the policy shift in terms of CBAM, whether it is now a tool to prevent carbon leakage. He also mentioned that it is opportunities vis-a-vis disruption, highlighted on energy efficiency, renewable energy, alternate fuel, and MSME sector was also a common thread between all the speakers. So he also highlighted, and he also urged that there should be a level playing field for domestic steel producers. So thank you, Mr. Gupta, for enlightening us with your thoughts. Mr. Sanjay Singh, a known veteran and former steel secretary, he also highlighted that it is a hard-to-abate sector and impact on 25% tax impact. The common thread of reporting mechanism was also highlighted by him. Verification issue, decarbonization, he highlighted that there is no escape. We have to face and be part of this decarbonization journey. But like Mr. Gupta, he also emphasized on hand-holding and capacity building for MSME. Mr. Arijit Sengupta also was on the same view. He highlighted the different initiatives taken by BE, earlier PAT scheme, which was more on energy, and CCTS, which is on GHG emissions. Other points on how we can incentivize those who are achieving the overachieving and in the credit system. He also emphasized, which other speakers has highlighted, that there should be fairness and equity in all these schemes. Dr. James, very elaborate presentations, and the common thread which I mentioned earlier. He also raised a point of whether it is in the ambit of trade violation or not, which is again a debatable point. Carbon leakage, which Mr. Gupta has also mentioned, that was also on the point, and what Mr. Sanjay Singh mentioned, that 20-25% tax impact on steel and 15 to 20% in aluminum. He also emphasized on simplified mechanism for MSME, which was again a common thread, and fairness and equity, which Mr. Arijit has also mentioned about 10 USD versus 100 USD. He also highlighted that the concerned ministry should take up with the different countries and how we can have a smooth landing on CBAM. So one thing which is very common, that decarbonization we need to take. It's not only today CBAM. Arpan also told that this coming from UK and Norway also. The only thing how prepared we are and how smooth our landing will be, that will be the key to CBAM and all the different sectors, right from aluminum or steel, who are exporting to Europe. So I would like to conclude with the famous couplet of वसीम बरेलवी की रात तो वक्त की पाबंद है ढल जाएगी, देखना यह है कि चिरागों का सफर कितना. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to speak before you. Thanks.
Thank you so much, sir, for summing up the opening session very comprehensively, highlighting what the speakers mentioned and what was the underlying theme of the discussion, whether it is in terms of decarbonization or whether it is in terms of the MSME support, the importance of negotiations, as well as the importance of fair and equal treatment to nations, to developing nations like India, and also in terms of the numbers that could be in terms of the impact that the steel and aluminum industry may bear because of the regulation. So with taking this opportunity, I thank all the speakers of our opening session who comprehensively set the tone for the discussions, the technical discussions and technical pointers to follow on from here. With this, I would now like to request Shri Anvesh Mazumdar, who is the Director Deloitte, to take over the sessions, the technical session one for almost an hour and or so. We have two very, very renowned speakers. We have Shri Alistair Ritchie, who is the director at Asia Society Policy Institute, and he will be sharing perspectives around the EU CBAM policy updates, the simplification, the learnings that have been there from the transitional phase, practical understandings that will help the Indian exporters in terms of MRV compliance and all. And also we have Shri Victor Perez, who is the co-founder and CEO for Carbon Glance. He again would be, talking about the MRV requirements under EU CBAM, the data requirements, the granular data points, which Sri Sanjay Singh ji mentioned. So he will highlight on all those things and the lessons learned and how we can move forward under this regulation. So over to you, Anvesh, for another hour or so, with two very, very renowned and speakers on the MRV and the EU CBAM.
Thank you, Arpan, for that introduction. So I see, there are almost 200 participants in this current chat. So I think there's a great enthusiasm amongst the participants about this topic. So this session, it has two focus areas. So what I'm planning to do is, maybe allocate half an hour for each of the focus areas. So for the first focus area, I will speak for about 3-4 minutes. Then I will request Mr. Alistair Ritchie to pitch in, and then we can have maybe 5-10 minutes of discussion through chat with the audience, because that's an important element of any session, given the large amount of interest. So,
Anvesh, just before you start,
yes,
I mean,
please.
my request, only one request, that probably we can have the interaction, the Q&A part
At the
after
very
both the
end.
speakers have spoken,
Sure, sure.
and then we can have the questions together.
Yes, that would also be
Thank
nice.
you so much, but sorry for interrupting.
No problem, no problem. So, this technical session one is about understanding CBAM in a bit more detail. And the first focus area is the EU carbon emissions, some policy updates. So first of all, I would like to welcome you all, distinguished dignitaries and esteemed colleagues from India as well as the EU and other countries, respected leaders, policymakers. So it's a privilege to welcome you to this technical session dedicated to understanding CBAM. Here, we would like to explore some aspects like, what have been some of the recent policy updates, key learnings from the transitional phase, which has been going on from, say, October 23, some practical implications for Indian exporters, and some next steps. So, this CBAM was evolved rapidly since its transitional phase started in October 23, and this will go on till December 25. At least it's expected to do so, unless, as Professor James said, it extends otherwise. And during this period, importers of high carbon goods like steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizers, etc., they're required to submit quarterly reports detailing the greenhouse gas emissions embedded. However, they are not yet required to purchase the certificates, which will start next year probably. Again, hopefully, or rather not hopefully, because we are hoping that it should be delayed. Uh, so as we prepare for this definitive phase, understanding these policy updates becomes very essential. So in February 25, the European Commission introduced the CBAM simplification package. This package introduces an exemption from reporting and certificate obligation for importers bringing in less than 50 tons of CBAM goods per calendar year. And this will approximately exempt 90% of the importers, especially the smaller ones, but still capture the majority of the emission. The Commission has recently also streamlined the authorization process for CBAM declarants. They have simplified the emission calculations and introduced stronger anti-abuse and anti-circumvention measures. For example, EU origin precursors are now de facto excluded from CBAM reporting as they are already covered in ETS. So this reporting threshold is now based on annual tonnage rather than value per consignment, providing a greater clarity. However, there are challenges from the Indian perspective, especially the transitional period has provided us with some critical insights. Some of our exporters have grappled with quarterly reporting requirements since October 23 and experienced the challenges firsthand of emissions monitoring, how to verify the data, how to comply with the reporting standards, etc. And earlier this month, the European Commission also launched a public consultation process to gather stakeholder inputs on potentially extending CBAM to certain downstream products. Now, what is the risk? Suppose India exports crude steel, some semi-finished steel to UAE, and using that, suppose they manufacture some finished product and then export it to the EU. If this rule comes into the picture, then that product will be taxed to India as well. So that could impact our exports even more. The practical understanding for Indian exporters have been shaped by several key developments. For example, the European Commission's release of default values in I think it was in end of 23, which provided some temporary relief because it allowed importers to use the standardized emission factors, whereas actual data was unavailable. However, now we have to transition from default values to actual embedded emissions data, and that has intensified the need for sophisticated monitoring systems. Also, as we enter into the next phase of CBAM, which is the definitive phase, the secondary legislation will also govern the rules for CBAM declarant registration or for emissions calculation, verifier accreditation, or even certificate management and anti-circumvention. And currently, the Commission is preparing an implementing act aligning CBAM verification principles with EU ETS practices. And they want to lay down the conditions how the national accreditation bodies will license proper verifiers against some ISO standards like ISO 14065, etc. And I think, we should all come together, the ministry, the industry, leading industry chambers like FICCI, like we have done now, to establish some sort of a portal maybe that provides regular policy updates, sector-specific webinars like we're doing currently, and a single window help desk, ensuring that, exporters, especially SMEs, which forms a large chunk, they stay informed and get supported as CBAM policy continues to evolve. I think with this brief introduction, I now invite our distinguished panelists to carry this conversation forward. Mr. Alistair Ritchie, he is Director, Asia Pacific Sustainability, Asia Society Policy Institute. So thank you for your patient hearing, and Alistair, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Anwesh, and it's a great honour to be invited to speak at this important webinar. Thank you to Arpan and to FICCI for this great opportunity. And as Anwesh has introduced, I'd like to talk about the developments of the EU CBAM and also updates around the EU ETS, which is connected to the EU CBAM, but also provide some recommendations for the carbon credit trading scheme, which we've heard about already, which would help to reduce the impact of the EU CBAM. So firstly, to set the context, we recently had, including with Arpan and some other participants in this webinar, visit to Brussels, and we met with DG Taxud and DG Klima, etc. And it's very important to understand that the broad context for the CBAM, the latest context, so that the EU Clean Industrial Deal is a very important policy that is being implemented in the EU to support industry's competitiveness in response to high energy prices and fierce competition. And the CBAM is actually one of the important elements of the Clean Industrial Deal. So the simplification and strengthening, which Anwesh has mentioned, is one of the key elements of this. So CBAM is clearly an important policy for the EU for protecting its industry. Also important is the strengthening of the Innovation Fund, which is connected because that is generating a lot of revenue to help industrial decarbonisation that we've heard about as being a challenge. In terms of the CBAM, so I guess you're familiar with some of the basics in terms of the fact that it's mirroring the EU ETS. So the sectors covered by the CBAM can only be those that are covered by the EU ETS. The main difference is that the EU ETS applies to installations, whereas the CBAM applies to goods. And it takes into account the carbon price effectively paid by the third country operator. So the calculation of the adjustment is very important. Within the calculation, there are some factors within the control of the third country, so in this case, India. So the actual embedded emissions and the carbon price effectively paid. So the lower the embedded emissions, the lower the CBAM charge, the higher the carbon price effectively paid, also the lower the CBAM charge. Clearly, the EU ETS price is outside the control of third countries, and as the free allocation in the EU goes down, the auction share in the EU goes up, and then that increases the CBAM charge. So the key things to focus on is to reduce the embedded emissions. So we've heard about the hard to abate sector of iron and steel, and the carbon credit trading scheme that was mentioned earlier as being very important policy, which I fully agree with, is very important for two ways. Number one, through the carbon price signal, it can drive low cost abatement and encourage decarbonisation. So companies that have options for low-cost reductions, can implement them and sell credits. But then, very importantly, the carbon credit trading scheme can generate revenue, and that revenue can be used to help investment in technologies that are not yet commercially viable. And there are many examples. There's hundreds of billions of dollars been generated now internationally by emissions trading systems to support reduction in embedded emissions. Clearly, the carbon price effectively paid is also important. So whilst the carbon credit trading is a very good policy, but for it to reduce the exposure to the CBAM, it will need to have an ambitious target, and it will need to avoid too much free allocation, which is a common problem with emissions trading systems. So it would need to gradually introduce auctioning, which is a way of increasing the carbon price effectively paid. As the CCTS evolves, then there may be consideration for an Indian CBAM to protect Indian companies from competition from other companies in jurisdictions that have less stringent limits. So as you can see here, the amount of free allocation, which is the primary way in which the EU has been trying to protect its industry from carbon leakage, is now being gradually phased out. By 2034, for the CBAM goods, it will be no free allocation. So they will be exposed to full auctioning, and they will have higher carbon costs. So the CBAM is to protect them from that. In terms of recent revisions, we've heard about some of these already from the introduction. So importantly, the administrative burden is going to be significantly reduced by introduction of the 50 tons per importer per year threshold. So this significantly reduces the number of companies covered, but also doesn't have much of an impact on the amount of emissions covered. So it's a very effective approach. The compliance with CBAM obligations will be simplified. So the authorization procedure for importers will be simplified. There will be more easy use of the default values for the embedded emissions and the carbon prices paid in third countries. And the emissions calculation will not need to include emissions related to downstream manufacturing processes for aluminium and steel goods. There's a new portal for third country operators to enable confidential handling of business sensitive information. And in terms of future developments, so later this year, we expect the CBAM review report. So we expect that there will be a limited set of additional sectors at risk of carbon leakage, potentially refineries, chemicals, paper and pulp, that could be included in the CBAM. Also indirect emissions, so the emissions related to electricity consumption for iron and steel, aluminium, hydrogen sectors could also be included. The impact on developing countries will be considered, and also the progress made in discussions around climate change. There's already moves around the extension to downstream goods. So there was an announcement recently by DG Klima. There will be a methodology that will be consistent on how to define and calculate the effective carbon price that's paid in the third country, and also a cause of perhaps confusion at the moment, it will be resolved through details on the accreditation of verifiers and verification principles to provide clarity on which verifiers are eligible for third country operators. And then also in parallel with that, there is recently an announcement about the proposal to mitigate the risk of carbon leakage for EU exporters, which has been one of the concerns on the EU side. In terms of the exposure, we've heard earlier in this meeting about the significant exposure of the steel industry and the aluminium industry in India. So this exposure is likely to increase in the future as the EU ETS price increases. The EU ETS is a main policy tool to help the EU achieve its climate objectives, and it recently announced a 90% target to achieve by 2040. So the carbon price is set to increase significantly in the future. There'll be a reduction in free allocation, which will also increase the CBAM charge, and the expansion of coverage to other sectors And we've also heard about the other jurisdictions developing CBAM, like UK, Taiwan also, and then under consideration US, Australia, Canada, Japan, South Korea. So as we've heard, the CBAM is here to stay, and it's an important policy to take into consideration, especially by thinking about how to reduce the embedded emissions in a cost-effective way. So coming on to the EU ETS, so this is the EU ETS is the reason for the CBAM. The CBAM is seeking to protect against carbon leakage of EU ETS installations. So the EU ETS continues to be the core policy in the EU to drive its achievement of its targets. It's been successful so far. It's reduced by 50% GHG emissions, and its scope is going to expand by including ETS2. It's also including maritime. The cap setting is top down, linked to the EU's overall targets, and then the allocation is entirely auctioning for the power sector, free allocation to sectors exposed to carbon leakage, with benchmarks equivalent to average of top 10% performance. In terms of the carbon price in the EU, this is very much a function of the cap. And as you can see here, the cap is continually declining in line with the EU's plan for net zero by 2050. And just to give you an idea, the linear reduction factor is the annual percentage reduction in the cap. And that's currently 4.3% per year. So every year, the cap drops by that amount, and then it increases to 4.4. So as you can see, there will be continual increases in the carbon price. So one of the critical issues is about finance, and jurisdictions globally are realizing the value of emissions trading systems like the carbon credit trading scheme to generate significant amount of finance. The EU has generated over 200 billion euros of revenue through auctioning of allowances, and about 90% is returned back to member states for climate and energy purposes. Some of it is used for the Innovation Fund and Modernisation Fund. And these are very good examples of how industries like steel industry, cement, aluminium, and others can get financial support to help invest in technologies like CCUS, green hydrogen, DRI steelmaking, and other technologies to enable them to decarbonize. These have been very successful policies, but they're highly oversubscribed because their industry wants more of the money from the EU ETS auction revenue to go to the things like the Innovation Fund, and this is an opportunity for India in the future as it develops its carbon credit trading scheme. And according to our estimates, we estimate that between $700 billion to $1.4 trillion of revenue could be generated by the CCTS in India up to 2050 if it allows the auctioning of allowances and includes the power sector like the global best practice ETSs. And this money could then be used and channeled to support clean energy and industrial decarbonisation. So the learning points from the EU ETS are, yes, it's very effective in reducing its emissions. There's been a big transition in the power sector, particularly towards renewables. The long-term targets have been very important, and extensive economic modelling has been essential to enable targets to be developed in a way that can achieve climate objectives, but also protect industrial competitiveness. And there's close consultation with industry. And I know that the CCTS involves very close consultation with industry, lots of working groups and so on. But the financial support has been critical to help companies decarbonise and comply with the tightening cap. And the recycling of auction revenue has helped to achieve that. So just the final slide, I wanted to look at the carbon credit trading scheme. And this represents a significant opportunity, not only through the conventional driver, which is the carbon price, through the motivation for companies to invest in low carbon operational and investment strategies, but also through the climate finance opportunity. So as the CCTS is successfully being rolled out, we think that there's a very great opportunity to develop a long-term plan for the development of the CCTS over the next 10 years, including the evolution of how the key elements might work, and supported by detailed economic, energy and policy impact modelling. developing options for the next period and the long-term plan. And that can also include an Indian CBAM itself. So as the targets get tighter, it would be more important to think about how to protect Indian companies as they're on their transition to net zero. Expanding the scope to the power sector is very important because that provides a lot of opportunity for decarbonisation at a low cost, and it will drive significant transition towards greater renewable energy, and it will also open the door for the generation of auction revenue. So it would be important to develop a framework for how carbon costs could be treated within the power market, and looking at the timing options for inclusion of the power sector and introduction of auctioning. So, for example, in Japan, they are planning to start auctioning in 2033 in their power sector. And even though they haven't started yet, because of that plan, they're able to introduce a climate transition bond, which will be paid off by auction revenue from their ETS. And this will generate $120 billion of revenue to support investment in decarbonisation for hard to abate sectors. So India could do something quite similar without having to develop its CCTS now. By making those commitments, it can then trigger upfront significant investment to support the decarbonisation. That would require a transition to an allocation-based ETS. Japan will be doing that from next year. That'd be relatively simple because the MRV is just the same. And then developing this finance mechanism, this is a great opportunity to support the investment that's needed in technologies that are not yet commercially viable, particularly looking at the option of a CCTS-linked climate transition bond. We're currently doing some work on that at the moment, assessing its feasibility, developing an action plan and roadmap for introduction of auctioning, and also developing and implementing the overall finance mechanism. So globally, this is a key focus of systems, and would definitely help to reduce the embedded emissions and to reduce the CBAM charge. So I think this could be implemented at the same time as India strengthens its policy and seeks to protect its industry and support a smooth transition to a decarbonised industry. Yes, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Alistair, for that enlightening presentation with those accurate insights. Some valid points really mentioned, how we can reduce embedded emissions and increase our carbon price spread abroad. That would really help us to reduce our CBAM burden compliance. And also I noted 2 points which are very important, which I think in all the industry players present here, they should note, that indirect emissions may be included in the future for steel and aluminum and other industries. So having clean energy, that's very important if we have to keep that in mind. And also funding, how do we fund this? Sorry, Lokesh, you're saying something? Okay, yes. And also, how can we take into account the funding mechanism? So I think in the audience round, we'll also ask from Bureau, someone from Mr. Ariji Sengupta is there, I think. So I will ask him during the audience round as to how we can allocate funding in the future. Can we start auction mechanism like Japan is planning to do? I think these are very key important takeaways for us. So thank you, Alistair. Thank you for your speech. Next, we will move on to the next focus area, that is about MRV. So in MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification of GHG emissions. So why is MRV critical from a CBAM perspective? Because it is the backbone of CBAM compliance. Like Mr. Sanjay Singh said, CBAM is essentially a monitoring, reporting, and accounting kind of a framework. So MRV is the backbone for that. And early action with respect to MRV is even more important because countries like UK, Canada, they are also exploring a CBAM kind of regulation. So it has triggered a broader global shift. So which is why this is a very important perspective which must be covered. Now the CBAM's MRV framework, it's sort of engineered to mirror the EU emissions trading system. During the transitional phase, which started from October 23, will go until December of this year, importers must report emissions across the 3 scopes: direct emissions, indirect for scope 2, and indirect from raw materials and upstream processes like scope 3. So India should also try to adopt and India is obviously making significant strides in developing MRV capabilities, but there still, there is a long way to go, and I would like to mention some few brief challenges that we are facing. But first of all, we have very few EU accredited verifiers, whereas thousands of units need annual audits, and they don't have any uniform nationally endorsed guidance as of now, although BE is preparing the same, NSC ICM is doing that. Then MSMEs, which I think others also mentioned previously, they constitute 30 to 40% of India's crude steel capacity, but they lack scale to incorporate these MRV systems, and which is why there is also exclusion from the EU supply chains. Third, while I think Mr. Arijit Sengupta has mentioned this, Bureau of Energy Efficiency has developed a comprehensive MRV framework for carbon credit scheme, including accreditation criteria for verification agencies. However, our CCTS is intensity based, which is obviously suited and tuned to our growth trajectory. But this also risks that EU may not recognize our intensity based credits. So we need to discuss on that risk aspect as well. EU's MRV framework, on the other hand, it has been refined over, say, last 10-15 years. The MRV system initially drew from the guidelines annexed to the EU ETS, and it has since evolved through successive reforms, stakeholder consultations, and today, EU boasts a mature MRV ecosystem with numerous accredited verification bodies and national bodies as well. So I think, some of the lessons learned and the applications can be, that the EU success, it stems from the early investment in digital platforms and automated systems. So we, as Indian industry, we must explore, cloud-based platforms, blockchain solutions, real-time data dashboards to ensure that the emissions data from raw material extraction to production to export, it is tamper-proof, transparent, and completely audit-ready. And companies must closely work with the suppliers to ensure that comprehensive emissions tracking across the value chain. And as a way forward, to remain competitive, I feel we can focus on some of the points. First would be, we should start by establishing baseline emission inventories, which are in the process of doing for all facilities while investing in digital monitoring infrastructure. Then we must implement automated data collection and real-time monitoring systems while modeling the CBAM certificate costs into our pricing and supply chain negotiation. The Indian carbon market, which is developing, it should be fast-tracked with mandatory implementation of, say, digital or shipment level MRV platforms and a significant expansion of the pool of EU accredited verifiers and nationwide industrial efficiency initiative integrating the perform achieve trade targets with the emerging carbon credit trading scheme. This can enable measurable emission reductions that directly inform CBAM compliance. And also the energy sector, because if EU starts to impose on the energy part, then we would need to deploy the clean energy as well to critically address the carbon intensity embedded in our exports. And I think to conclude this brief introduction, I think as forward thinking leaders, we should view MRV not as a compliance cost, but more as a transformation catalyst where robust MRV systems, they unlock premium markets. They can help us to access green financing and demonstrate ESG leadership. So the question is not whether we can afford to invest in robust MRV systems, but whether we can afford not to lead this transformation. Now, I would like to invite our esteemed panelist, Mr. Victor Perez Prieto. He's the co-founder and CEO of Carbon Glance to share his views on this topic. Victor, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, can you hear me well? Can you hear me well?
Yes, you're audible, Victor. You're visible, you're audible.
Okay, so let me share my screen now. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you very much for inviting me, first of all. In this session, I will focus on the MRV requirements under the EU CBAM. I will also touch some points on data quality and cost efficiency. And finally, I will conclude the session with some lessons that have been learned and that can be of application for Indian producers. First of all, let me clarify some terms to avoid confusion as I go through this technical presentation. What is an operator? Because I will be using this term frequently, it's any person who operates or controls an installation in a third country or in a non-EU country. And I may refer to them as exporters, non-EU suppliers, manufacturers, or third country operators. And the same goes with the concept of installation. What is an installation? Is a stationary technical unit where a production process is carried out. In simple terms, is a production or manufacturing plant. First of all, the EU CBAM monitoring rules, as already has been mentioned, have been designed based on the MRV system of the EU ETS. And that's why there's some already lessons that can be extracted from that system. Under the EU CBAM, operators have to monitor so-called embedded emissions, which is also a term that has emerged in previous sessions, which are defined in parallel to the emissions causing CO2 costs in the EU ETS, so that both importers and installations under the EU ETS face the same carbon cost. So now let's go into the MRV requirements in more detail. First of all, we need to ask who must monitor CBAM emissions. So you will get CBAM data requests if you are a producer of CBAM goods exporting your products to the EU. But that's not the only case where you might be asked to provide CBAM data. You might also be a producer of CBAM goods selling to another manufacturer, so to another factory of CBAM goods, who themselves export their products to the EU. In this case, they will come to you and they will ask you to provide CBAM data to them as well, because they will need this data to perform their own CBAM calculations so that they can share this data with their EU-based clients. And the final case where you might actually be requested CBAM data is where you are a CBAM producer selling to traders who export their goods to the EU, and therefore they will get data requests from the European Union, which will get forwarded to you as a producer. Now, what do you need to monitor? First of all, it's important to highlight that the EU CBAM regulation covers over 550 goods. And to simplify monitoring, what the European Commission did is grouping these goods into so-called aggregated goods categories. And keep this general rule in mind because it's super relevant. So under CBAM, each aggregated goods category corresponds to one production process. And this is the general rule, but there will be exceptions to this general rule, which we will see in a second. But first of all, what is a production process? So the production process means the system boundaries which are needed to attribute emissions to a specific goods produced. And you will be able to better understand this concept with an illustration. So you can see here the example of an integrated steel mill where we have the sinter plant, the blast furnace, and so on and so forth. So each one of them corresponds to a single production process. Why? Because the goods that are being produced in each of those units, let's say, belong to separate aggregated goods categories. So this is the general rule. However, as I mentioned before, there will be exceptions to this general rule. One of these exemptions is where, for example, you have separate production routes in your factory. Now, what does this mean? A separate production route means the technology, the industrial route that is being used to produce the CBAM goods. So in that case, what would happen is that you would define a production process for each different production route. This is a non-realistic example, but imagine that in the integrated steel mill, instead of having only the basic oxygen furnace, we would also have the smelting reduction process to produce crude steel. In that case, we would split the production process and we would monitor the emissions of each production process separately. This also makes sense, right? Because you want to monitor the emissions separately because the emissions intensity will be different in each case. Another common example of this is, for example, with primary and secondary unwrought aluminum, meaning recycled and non-recycled aluminum. Both belong to the same aggregated goods category, unwrought aluminum, but you would split them into separate production processes because each of them will have very different emission intensities. Another exception to the general rule is the bubble approach. This is a simplification introduced by the European Commission that allows factories to basically group everything into a single production process. Now, why is this a huge simplification? Because if you have separate production process, as we have here, you would have to monitor the fuel that you consume in this production process, separately, the fuel that you consumed here separately as well, and the same applies with raw materials, with electricity. So you will have to attribute quantities to each separate production process. Under the bubble approach, this is not required at all. You can simply say, okay, my integrated steel mill in all these processes, we bought this amount of fuel, we bought this total amount of electricity, we bought this total amount of goods outside of the installation, and then you can attribute all those quantities to a single production process. So you can see that the monitoring requirements would be much simpler. Now, there is a key condition to be able to apply this, which is that you cannot sell any of the goods that you are producing to a third party. Meaning you also have, for example, if I would be producing pig iron in my installation, I wouldn't be able to sell my pig iron to a third party if I want to use the bubble approach. As soon as you sell the pig iron, for example, here to a third factory, the bubble approach would no longer be permitted, and you would have to monitor your emissions separately by production process. And the final exemption to the general rule is where you decide to voluntarily split the same production process into sub-production processes, even if you are only speaking about a single aggregated goods category. So moving forward in what you need to monitor at each production process level, the first thing that you need to monitor is your direct emissions. These are the emissions from the production processes of CBAM goods, and this includes heating and cooling, irrespective of where this heating and cooling was produced. So you might be importing heating from another factory, and that heating will account as direct emissions. If you are familiar with frameworks like the Greenhouse Protocol, you might be thinking, well, under that framework, we would put that under scope 2, so as indirect. But under CBAM, this is not the case. They belong to direct emissions. And now there are two methods to calculate direct emissions under the EU CBAM. One is the calculation-based approach, and the other one is the measurement-based approach. The calculation-based approach is very simple to understand how it works. Basically, you would take the quantity of fuel, raw materials, and any other parameters, and you would multiply that by a specific emission factor or other type of calculation factor, like the net calorific value, oxidation factor, and so on and so forth. And then the other method is the measurement-based approach, where basically you would install a device in your factory, and you would, which is called a continuous emission measurement system. You would usually install this device at a suitable point of your factory, like the stack. And this device will monitor the concentration of greenhouse gases and the flow of flue gas for each emission source. And now, it is relevant to mention that these two methods are optional, meaning you can decide which one you want to implement. There are only two cases where you cannot decide which one to implement. One is where you have to monitor nitrous oxide emissions. So for the steel sector, this doesn't apply. In that case, the measurement-based approach is mandatory. And the other case is, again, not applicable for the steel sector, is for monitoring PFC emissions for primary aluminum production. From the experience of the EU ETS, what we know is that most operators actually decided to use the calculation-based method to calculate their emissions. Why? It's simple. It's cheaper and it's permitted. So as long as you can use it, the recommendation is that you use it because, again, the measurement-based approach involves significant resources and know-how. And as you can imagine, it involves also installing some devices at your installation, which will be more costly. Now, moving forward on what else you need to monitor, you also need to monitor your indirect emissions. Indirect emissions correspond to the electricity that was consumed during the production processes of CBAM goods. Again, here, irrespective of where that electricity was located. So that means that even if you are an auto producer of electricity in your factory, you produce your own electricity, you will have to account those emissions as indirect. Coming back to the example of the greenhouse gas protocol, in that case, for example, you would assign those as direct emissions, but again, CBAM has its own accounting rules. And the most common situation will be where you have to calculate your emissions from electricity coming from the grid, right? To calculate those emissions is quite simple. You will have to take a default emission factor, either provided by the European Commission based on IA data, or from another publicly available database, and you will multiply that times the quantity of electricity consumed in the production process. We usually recommend using Ember as the data source because it's reliable and it's also publicly available. And the final piece of the puzzle that you need to monitor as a factory operator is the so-called relevant precursors. These are goods that are used as inputs in your production processes that themselves are CBAM goods. Now we need to distinguish here between internal precursors and external precursors. Why? Because if the precursors is coming from another factory, you will have to collect this data from them and add the data to your own calculations. So you can see here in this example, we have only internal precursors. So sintered ore is a relevant precursor to pig iron. Pig iron is a relevant precursor to crude steel. So when we calculate the emissions of each of these goods, essentially we will be adding the embedded emissions of each of them in the calculations. But it could also be the case where you are purchasing the relevant precursors from another factory. In this case, let's imagine we have the sinter plant operated by a separate company. In this case, factory 2 would have to request the CBAM emissions data from factory 1 for the sintered ore and add this data to their own calculations. Let me quickly mention or quickly explain you how the data sources or the data works for the calculation-based approach, because you might be thinking, okay, let's say I have already my consumption of fuel, my consumption of electricity. What do I need to, where can I get the values, right, to multiply those parameters? So let's say you need to calculate your emissions for natural gas, and you need to multiply that times an emission factor or times a net calorific value. Where do I get this data? So under the EU CBAM, there is flexibility to choose from which source you can bring this data. Based on which sources are of higher or lower quality. So the lowest quality are the so-called type 1 standard values. Let's put them, or you can think of them as global values, so they are less accurate. Type 2 standard are more accurate. They are usually set at the national level. For example, the UNFCCC inventories that are submitted by countries every year. And then the highest possible quality of data comes from laboratory analysis. If you, for example, do a laboratory analysis of the fuel that you consume to know how much carbon content is in that fuel. Of course, this will result in more accurate calculations of emissions, and that's why they're the highest possible quality. So now that we've explained these basic concepts, let's quickly go through the main steps to calculate your CBAM emissions. So the first one is check whether your products fall within the scope of CBAM. The second one is you need to define your reporting period. Important reporting period, the default case for third country operators is the calendar year. It's not quarterly. There is a lot of misconceptions around this. Usually exporters tend to provide data on a quarterly basis, but that's not the recommendation by the Commission. The recommendation is report your data once per year. So for example, you would pick 2024 and that would be your reporting period. And the third step would be define your installations boundaries. We already explained how many aggregated goods categories, how many production routes, and based on that, you would define how many production processes you need to establish, as we already explained. So that then you would identify your inputs, you would identify your outputs, and then you would identify the emissions that need to be monitored. The fourth step would be determine the methodology. We already mentioned the two main ones. So let's say you pick the calculation-based approach. And then the final step would be to attribute the emissions to production process and ultimately to your products. Why? Because CBAM follows a top-down approach. What does this mean? That you would first calculate all of your emissions from all of your fuels, raw materials, electricity that you consume in your installation. Then you would attribute the quantities of those fuels, raw materials, and electricity to the different production processes. So you would attribute thereby emissions. And finally, you would by divide the total emissions of the production process by the total quantity produced in that production process, get to your carbon intensity of products, get to the CBAM data that you need to share with your clients. Very quickly, this is a visual example. We have here an installation consuming natural gas and electricity. We first calculate the total direct and indirect emissions from natural gas and electricity. Then we would attribute those emissions to the production process. So we would get to the emissions at the production process level. And then we would do the same with our relevant precursors, so CBAM goods purchased from another factory. We would attribute the quantities purchased to the production process, thereby attribute the emissions of those goods to our production process. And as a final step, we would attribute our production process level emissions to our goods, basically by dividing the total emissions of the production process by the total quantity produced in our production process, in this case, 10,000 tons. This is the final slide, and with this, I will conclude. Some lessons and recommendations that you should follow. First, put in place a monitoring methodology documentation. This would be sort of your CBAM handbook that you and your personnel will use as a basis for performing monitoring tasks in a consistent way during the coming years. So this will include the methodology that you use, calculation-based or methodology or measurement-based for each parameter, all the parameters that you have to monitor, all the calculation factors that you've been using, potential improvements, etc., etc. Second, if possible, again, start with the calculation-based approach. It's more cost-effective. If you can, it's permitted, and is the most common method under the EU ETS. Third, engage with suppliers and customers. Engage with your customers early on so that you can share the data in a seamless way. And importantly, with your suppliers, if you are purchasing also CBAM goods, because you will need that data to perform and complete your own calculations. Prepare for verification. I believe verification has already been mentioned in previous sessions. It will become mandatory starting in January 2026. And as a final recommendation and lesson, I would say, leverage the European Commission's free available resources that they've already made available. They made a communication template available to simplify calculations and sharing of the CBAM data. Is an optional resource. And then you also have a portal section that the Commission made available in case you as an exporter wants to input your data there and share it simultaneously with all of your clients. So I'll leave it here so we have some time for questions, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Victor, for that wonderful presentation. We really came to know a lot about, how CBAM is different from the GHG emissions scheme, like, scope 1, scope 2, etc. I also noted an interesting point about, how we should go for, that we need to report the data per year and not quarterly, because that's a common misconception, I think, which you have clarified for us. So now I think we have some time. We have about 10-15 minutes. I would like to open the floor to the audience for their questions, if any. If someone has any questions for our esteemed panelists who are here, you can just type it in your chat box and our panelists can respond, Alistair and Victor. If someone has any questions, please. Okay, so Rishabh has mentioned what is the requirement of third-party verification for CBAM in present and future. So Victor, if you could please respond to that.
Yes, so essentially what will happen starting in January 2026 is that an operator of a factory will need to hire an accredited verifier. It will have to be a third independent party. And again, it will have to be accredited. And that third party will have to verify all of your embedded emissions, all of your emissions that you plan to share with your clients in the EU. So once this data has been verified, and importantly, verifiers, if you have input your data in the third country operator portal that I mentioned, they will be able to access the portal and verify the data from there as well. So once the data has been verified, you will be able to share it with your client, and your client will be able to use it. If the data is not verified, your client, your customer in the EU won't be able to use the data. And this is very important. Won't be able to use the data, and they will have to rely on the default values, meaning your products will likely be more expensive.
Okay. And I think Amit Sharma has raised some questions. Can you see them, Victor and Alistair, in the Q&A box? They have raised some questions. If you can see them, then, if not, I will.
Anvesh, I have a question for Alistair.
Yes,
You
please,
know,
Arpan.
in the opening session, we were discussing that with other countries like UK, Norway, even the US, they could follow suit in terms of CBAM type regulations. Now, when this comes up amidst the EU CBAM regulation, which is already there, how do we see the global trade? I'm coming more from an economic perspective, the policy perspective sides. I'm not onto the technical side of MRVs and all. But how do we see the global trade in terms of global trade disruption or in terms of global trade smoothing out? Or because if every country has kind of a regulation which is more in terms of, while yes, we are to correct that we need to move towards decarbonization and green steel or say the greener products. But ultimately, if you look at it, if every country has this kind of a regulation, then how will the global trade move across the borders? Because it could be a kind of a restrictive or this thing for the trade to happen actually in actual terms. So if all these regulations do come in, then where is the future of the global trade?
Thank you, Arpan. That's a big question. In terms of the global trade, yeah, it's difficult to assess, but I think from the perspective of each jurisdiction, the key priority is to think about safeguarding industry's international competitiveness. So that's the driver of each jurisdiction, and that should be the preoccupation for the Indian policymakers to ensure that the CCTS is developed and implemented, rolled out in a way that enables achievement of India's NDC, but also enables this transition to decarbonized technology in a way that provides financial support to industry and reduces the exposure. Because as we can see, multiple jurisdictions are looking at their own CBAM. Any jurisdiction that's looking to implement a carbon price is thinking about how they can protect against carbon leakage. So I think that the race is on really to decarbonize as quickly as possible in the most economically viable way. And I think that's why it's so important to mobilize the tools available. So that India has a wonderful tool. The carbon credit trading scheme is a perfect policy. And there's many examples of how these can be used to support decarbonisation and to reduce exposure to CBAM, which is ultimately that the EU's driver is not to generate revenue from a CBAM charge, it's to try and promote decarbonisation. So yeah, you're asking a very big question, but I think that it also links to the need for detailed economic analysis of the climate policy mix and how what targets are going to be needed in the long term. Because also, as we see from the EU, one of the benefits of their system is that they have long-term targets that are linked to their top-down climate goals. So yes, it's a challenging environment, but I think that there's definitely a race on, and looking at the best practice, looking at Japan and other jurisdictions can give some great ideas to India in how to develop a leading policy that can minimize the CBAM exposure, but also help decarbonisation and achieving NDC targets.
Sure. Thank you, Alistair. Anvesh, maybe a couple of questions you can take, and then we will move on to the next technical session.
Okay, sure, Arpan. Just a message. There are plenty of questions. And I think Smita, yes, Arpan.
Yeah, there is one on this the 50-ton exemption limit. So it has been asked by Rakesh Sahu that is 50-ton exemption limit for individual goods like 50-ton steel and 50-ton aluminium. How is it like this 50-ton being envisaged? Maybe Victor would like to answer on this, or Alistair, anyone?
Happy to ask to answer. Are you referring? Yeah. So the threshold, and I guess you are referring to the new de minimis threshold of 50 tons.
Yes.
The threshold applies to all the goods that you're importing that are under CBAM, not to a specific CBAM goods. So it's an overall threshold. Yeah, that's the answer, essentially. There are a few other questions on a more technical basis. Maybe those will take some extra time, but Anvesh, I don't know if you want to pick one of them.
So, I think there's a question around scope 3. So Madhuri asked question that, our upstream and downstream scope 3 emissions, are they mandatory to be reported for CBAM yet? And how will it impact the verification scope for embedded emissions?
Yeah, so the scope 3 emissions are somehow limited to what I called before the relevant precursors. So that's what under CBAM for producers represents the scope 3 emissions. So another very common example is clinker and cement. If you're a cement producer, you need to monitor the emissions of your purchased clinker. So to answer the question, yes, scope 3 are mandatory, but only the ones related to the goods that are within the CBAM scope. Now, how will this impact verification is a very good question, because if you are a producer exporting to the EU, but you are relying on data that needs to be shared by your own supplier, you won't be able to verify your own data until you also get the verification from your own supplier. So verification will sort of become a cross supply chain requirement, where you will need to get your suppliers to also verify their own share of emissions. Otherwise, you will likely exceed the 20% permitted threshold of the default values, and you won't be able to use the data.
Thank you, Victor. So I think keeping in mind the our session, timings, I think we have to close the session now. I would like to thank you both, Victor and Alistair, for your enriching PPTs and discussions that we have had. So thank you both. Next, Arpan, I hand over to you for further
Sure.
session.
Thank you, Anvesh. Thank you for moderating the session. And thank you both the speakers, Victor and Alistair, for highlighting in terms of the MRV requirements, in terms of the ETS, EU ETS and the carbon scheme. So thank you so much for value adding to this program, sharing your insights, which will detail out in terms of the MRV process that the Indian exporters need to, and also on the simplification. We now move on to the next technical session, which is in terms of involving all the stakeholders, be it in terms of the users, be it in terms of the tech providers, be it in terms of the carbon societies itself. So I would request Rajiv to take over from here. We have a wide array of panelists. We have Mr. Naveen Alawat from Jindal Steel, Ms. Prachi Priya from Hindalco Industries, Dr. Anil Dhawan from Alloy Steel Producers Association, Mr. Atul Sharma from Sarvada Legal to bring in the global legal trade perspectives, Mr. Harsh Chaudhary from Central World on the tech part of it, and Ms. Nishta Singh from Asia Society Policy Institute, again to talk about the global trade. So with these initial remarks, thanking our speakers for technical session 1, I now invite Rajiv Mehta, who is a partner at Deloitte India, to take over for technical session 2.
Thank you, Arpan. I hope I am audible to all of you.
Yes, you are. Maybe a little louder and it will be perfect.
Yes. So we'll start the technical session 2, which is basically around green transition strategies, policy support, and cooperation on carbon pricing. So I think all of that.
There is a voice break in your this thing.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yeah, it is much better now. Maybe a little closer to the speaker. That will also.
Okay. Right. I think I have been hearing all the speakers so far. I think really insightful, insights, and a lot of points came up. So I think more importantly, we have very eminent panelists here. Arpan mentioned about Mrs. Saurabh Banerjee, who's a member of FICCI Steel Committee and Vice President, Sustainability JSW Limited. Mr. Naveen Alawat, Head Power to X, Green Steel, Green Hydrogen at JSPL. Mrs. Prachi Priya, Vice President, Economic and Public Policy Research and Advocacy and ESG Strategy at Hindalco. Dr. Anil Dhawan, whom I know from long, Director General, Alloy Steel Producer Association. Sri Atul Sharma, co-founder of Sarvada Legal. Mr. Harsh Chaudhary, co-founder Central World, and last of not least is Ms. Nishta Singh, Assistant Director of Climate Asia Society Policy Institute. So I think what we all understand, and I will not go into details,
Rajiv, there is a voice break. I mean, maybe you can try switching off the video. Maybe a bandwidth issue.
That would be helpful. Is it better?
No, Rajiv. Still in a challenging position.
Okay. Let me know if you can hear me properly.
We apologize for this technical glitch. And just give us a couple of minutes.
Am I audible to all, or is it still
Coming very weak, Rajiv. Otherwise, it is okay, but very weak. Rajiv, can you hear us? I think he's just switching to another network. Maybe a minute or so, please.
audible now, or is it better?
A little better than the previous one.
Yes. So I'll just keep me closer to the mic. So what we understand is today we have an exposure of close to 8 billion worth of CBAM covered goods, which is flowing annually from India to the EU. And of course, we know the key sectors that will be impacted. Steel is the major sector. We are exporting close to we exported close to 3.3 million tons of steel last year, and Indian steel industry is significantly higher carbon intensity compared to the global benchmarks. We have almost 2.5, 2.6 compared to which is 25% in some of the other competing nations. So which will have an impact from a financial point of view for the steel exporters. Other issues around the technology and structural challenges. We all know that we are primarily the BFBF route, the production route dependency, the raw material constraint, because we also need to focus on our indigenous thermal coal because the DRIs, so that impacts the footprint. Moving on to the aluminium sector. The aluminium sector also has a significant impact. Indian aluminum export to the EU almost 25% of total aluminum exports compared to only 11% for China. And of course, this will be also impacted. Besides the aluminium and steel, we also know that certain other sectors which are high carbon intensity, like fertilizers, electricity, cement, and so on, all those emission intensive. So this will also impact future impact on sectors. And clearly there are challenges in terms of regulatory issues, compliance burden. We heard about the data collection and the MRV infrastructure that will be required, verification related challenges, and of course the financial and competitive pressures. Besides this, we also have a lot of MSMEs working in the steel and aluminum and cement and other value chains, which will be impacted by the requirements in terms of technical, financial capacity building, or the compliance as well as reporting. So what is important is as a way forward, it's important that we need to have a clear-cut strategy and roadmap in terms of strengthening our engagement on the climate policies. Of course, it's happening at multiple platforms and forums. But more importantly is strengthening our domestic carbon market infrastructure. So we heard about carbon trading scheme, which is CCTS. We heard about which we are trying to operationalize at the earliest, and the digital MRV platforms. We heard about the accreditation bodies for CBAM verification, but also to set up and scale up our low carbon technologies and energy transition. So green investment. So we have the green steel taxonomy, which have been introduced recently. So that is very important. Mobilization of green investment financing, R&D, and of course the public procurement of green steel and green aluminum, which is going to be critical for the low carbon transition. And last is of course looking at the renewable energy adoption, looking at MSMEs. How do we empower MSMEs with technical and financial support? So these will be the important areas as we see for us to thrive in the dynamic market globally. So the session would focus on how the Indian exporters can pivot towards a low carbon future by investing in product innovation, leveraging policy support, and collaborating with global stakeholders. So the key topic of discussions would be what would be the mechanism for creating product level decarbonization roadmaps, compliance mechanism on the CCTS, role of digital and technological innovations, leveraging carbon schemes like PLI for green technologies, enabling voluntary carbon markets and global recognition. And last is, of course, the entire role of R&D, role of startups, role of PPPs to kind of move this agenda forward. So that's broadly what I wanted to say about where we stand today. And of course, some of the eminent speakers have already spoken quite a bit about various strategies and the way ahead for us. But probably I'll start off with our panelists here. So I'll start off with Saru Banerjee, who is a member of FICCI Steel Committee and also President Sustainability JSW Limited. So Mr. Banerjee, my question to
Rajiv Swaroop is joining a little late. You can probably go ahead with the other panelists.
Sure. So maybe I'll move on to Mrs. Prachi Pia, which is Vice President, Economic and Public Policy Research and Advocacy and ESG Strategy at Hindalco. So Prachi, the question for you is, how do you see the Indian aluminium exports amidst the growing trade regulations such as EU CBAM and of course following the UK CBAM? And how is Hindalco and some of the industry proponents preparing?
A very good afternoon. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. So I think when we look at the European Union CBAM, it's been almost 4-5 years when the first draft came. We started looking at it, and we started looking at it very myopically in terms of what is our direct exposure to EU in terms of how much we are exporting. And I think you've already mentioned, even in terms of direct exposure, it is a pretty significant share that EU market holds, around $2.1 billion of exports of entire Chapter 76, which is around 25% of our overall exports, of Indian exports to the EU market. So that's a significant number. But I think once the reporting period started and the demand from customers kept on coming in terms of reporting your emissions in terms of the CBAM template, the global value chains today are so interlinked that I think till that point we never realized that a customer sitting in Japan or say Malaysia, where we are exporting say a primary ingot, aluminium ingot, or a midstream product, will also demand a CBAM template. Because you have to capture the embedded emissions when we are eventually exporting to European Union. And so I think first thing is we should not just focus on the direct exposure. The indirect exposure is quite a bit, and it will only intensify as time passes. So I would say CBAM has become the new green template. When you say green aluminium or green steel, it's become the new green template for reporting. And of course, most of our plants, we've, taken help, prepared them well in terms of reporting. We were actually quite well ahead of time in terms of reporting, verification, and all of that. But having said that, at this point in time, till the time there is clarity by 2030, 2031, whether, the real differentiator in terms of the impact on aluminium sector would be if indirect emissions are under the scope of CBAM or not, because some of the previous speakers were talking about how the scope of emissions under CBAM is different from GHG scope. So till the time, for the tax purpose, indirect emissions or emissions from electricity are out, since Indian aluminium producers are heavily dependent on coal. Smelters have to run 24/7 on stable power, and hence we, most of our smelters run on captive power plants, which is coal backed. Of course, in terms of strategies, we are trying some pilot projects which can be run on renewable plus pumped hydro technology, but there is still some time. And of course, there's discussion on nuclear energy being used in running some smelters. That's a discussion that's going on globally as well as in Asia. I would say the real impact would come when indirect emissions are taken into the scope of CBAM, and that would be the real hit in terms of ad valorem rates, because then the impact would be maybe over 70-75%. Till this time, given the EU carbon price right now, and as some of you spoke about the CCTS being rolled out, the CCTS price, when it is discovered, would be much, much lower, in the range of $8 to $10 per ton of CO2 is the estimate provided by BE, would be much lower compared to the EU carbon price today. So all in all, huge indirect impact, and once the scope is expanded, if and when, it will be quite high. So that is what I wanted to highlight from the aluminum industry side.
Thank you, Ms. Priya. So I think clearly you said that this is an opportunity in adversity. And moving on to Ms. Alawat, especially from a steel sector point of view. So of course, I think there are a lot of activities as well as actions around preparing for CBAM. So as a steel, I would say, leading steel producer, how are you taking forward the CBAM regulation in terms of green steel production, exports to the EU, and overall decarbonization strategy in JSPL? If you can talk about some of the key levers of decarbonization and how successful and some of the pilots that you may have done already.
Thanks, Raj. Thanks for the question. So I think CBAM is basically an imperative now. It's no more a choice. So we have to start warming up, and we have already started warming up. So the recently announced CCTS, I think that has been actually announced by the Ministry of Steel, and then with BE. I think that is much more. We believe that is much more comprehensive as compared to CBAM. So. Because right now the scope 2 is out of the scope 1 is there, and there are so many questions, and I think as we move along, those questions will be answered, it will be more clarified. But I think we are, as an integrated steel maker, we are very much actually, prepared to encash this as an opportunity. We are not, thinking this as a punishment, and it's more of an opportunity for a country like India, because we clearly see this as one of the enabler for the export, and I think it is actually a business case. It is no more a cost center. We believe it can definitely be a profit center as we move along, because if we get our duck in the row, I think it can also be a huge opportunity, business opportunity, where we can easily command a premium of close to 60 to 100 odd euros per ton, right? So that will be like close to 10 to 15 odd percent on an average above your base steel prices. So that's one. Second, so far as our decarb strategy is concerned, so we believe that the priorities are very much aligned. The focus is basically, the first bucket of focus is operation excellence. So as far as the operation excellence is concerned, wherever we see flue gases going out of our processes, where we see the waste coming out from our process, where we see how we can deploy the circularity, where we can also sort of deploy the building blocks, the molecules that we have in our plant. That is the idea, how we can sort of valorize those molecules, how we can convert waste into wonder. Because the moment we convert waste into wonder, automatically wealth is going to follow, right? So this is where the focus is. Our focus is more on the responsible and sustainable steel making, because things are not going to be green tonight, right? We have to follow a transition plan, and we believe that synthesis gas is, for us, the coal-based synthesis gas coupled with the renewable energy and carbon capture utilization is going to be the amazing answer, that the transition before we converge into the green product. So operation excellence has a role to play. The second is about the energy excellence and the renewable energy. So energy excellence, deployment of the variable frequency drives, converting all the flue gases into power, the waste heat convert into power, and using it in our operation. That is where we believe that energy excellence has a huge role to play. There are so many low temperature and high temperature calories stream coming from our casters, from our electric arc furnaces, from our DRI plant, can be used into energy. So the focus is converting waste heat into energy, and also some of the streams can also be an amazing input to the electrolyzers to generate green hydrogen. So that is the second focus, the deployment of renewable energy. As we speak, we believe that we have we have reached to the peak of the maturity curve, learning curve, the price curve. So far as the solar is concerned, wind is concerned, the battery energy storage. And I'm pleased to inform that we are busy right now putting up a 1.5 gigawatt solar farm. By exactly this time next year, this plant will be commissioned and we'll start using this power to power our operations, steel operation across our plant. And with a gap of 1 odd years, we are also going to commission 1 gigawatt of wind farm that is coming up in Karnataka and in Tamil Nadu. Apart from this, there is a huge thirst on the deployment of nuclear energy, and with this monsoon season, we believe that the two important amendments, the Atomic Energy 1962 and the CLND Act, will be ratified, and it will open gates for the private sector, the new technologies that can come in, where we can sort of optimize the overall cost with a better yield, with a better efficiency, and this nuclear energy can be a very good source for providing the base load. Along with this, the pump hydroelectric storage that is also more or less mature. So we are busy basically putting up a lot of feasibility studies, and we have identified 3-4 sites across the state of Chhattisgarh and Odisha to sort of align this pump hydroelectric storage with our operation. So this, we believe, is absolutely the low hanging. The incremental capex is 3 to 4 odd %, but the impact on the carbon intensity will be whopping 15 to 17 odd % to 20% when we see the renewable energy also coupled with our operation. So this, we believe, is absolutely the low hanging quick wins. Going forward, I think carbon capture utilization is definitely going to be answered, whether we like it or not. It is definitely going to be one of the key enabler. And if it will be coupled with storage, then I think it can solve a lot of problem, and it can actually promote the hub and cluster model. Right, so that is the second one, and I'm pleased to inform the audience that we have come up with an expression of interest for setting up carbon capture utilization cluster at our Angul facility, and there are so many responses, good responses, offers that we have received. So we believe that in good 3 to 4 odd years, we can set up these clusters, which can be an amazing model for basically circular model, and where the captured CO2 can be valorized and utilized among so many usages, from the chemicals to minerals to basically the circularity, making co-electrolysis, making blue synthesis gas. So this is also, and along with this, we are also warming up with the production of green hydrogen. We are going to commission one of the 30 megawatt electrolyzer plant within the next 5 to 6 odd months, and basically the idea is how we can sort of do the proof of concept of putting up 900 normal meter cube green hydrogen to push it along with the synthesis gas into our vertical shaft furnace for DRI making. So I think we are aligned. The decarb strategy is aligned. We want to be net zero by 2047, and that is where the whole idea is. Idea is, I think from our side, it is very clear. The strategy is very clear. The next steps are very clear. The responsibilities are clear. It is about how quickly we deploy this strategy on the ground. I think that is going to be the main differentiating factor. Otherwise, most of us know the answer. It is about putting those answers on the ground. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naveen-ji. I think very well said, and some of your key initiatives you highlighted quite effectively. So I think next we have Nishita Singh, Assistant Director, Climate Asia Society Policy Institute. So just a question for you from a policy standpoint, from a global policy standpoint, how do you view India's positioning on carbon-linked trade mechanisms like CBAM, and what would be the key policy measures or initiatives that you feel that India should look at kind of calibrate with the global ecosystem?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the question. I think in terms of global policy standpoint, there are two critical things, and these are also pretty apart from each other. So the first one is emphasizing on CBDR, so about differentiated responsibilities, and a lot of speakers have spoken about it before also. We have discussed it in this session, that it is important for India to emphasize that there is common but differentiated responsibility, and the finance and technical know-how should flow from global north to global south, as it was discussed in Kyoto Protocol. However, the second thing is that there's also a need to realize that global carbon pricing is now a reality. And it is important for us to demonstrate that India is also on the path of decarbonizing the industrial sector. So launching the CCTS has been one of the important milestones that India has reached this year, and this gives out a strong message that India is on the path to to record its emissions in the industrial sector and then reduce it. So I think there are these two important points. That one is that we need to emphasize that there is still a need for finance and technical know-how flow from global north to global south. And second is establishing the leadership and establishing some sort of cooperation between South and South to understand how, for example, Asian jurisdictions can come together to learn from each other in terms of best practices. So, for example, inclusion of power sector, there are common challenges, let's say in China, Korea, India, Indonesia, about inclusion of power sector. So there is an opportunity to learn from experiences of different jurisdictions, and India can place itself also as one of the members which helps in coordination, also putting a stronghold in the diplomatic sense that how do we ensure that CBDR principles are followed.
Thank you for your answer, Nishtha. So one question I had is just in a follow-on. So there's a lot of MSMEs also in the I would say ecosystem. I didn't see it as well as the ecosystem that is impacted by CBAM. So what are some of the learnings from other countries? How are they preparing for it, a similar kind of ecosystem in their production ecosystem?
In terms of inclusion in CBAM, after the simplification process that EU introduced, I think a month back, it actually relieves a lot of SMEs from CBAM, but also it is important to realize that that won't be the case forever. So, eventually they will be added to the regulation. I think the important point here is to provide financial support to SMEs to transition. Second is to think of an MRV system for SMEs so that the cost of MRV is not greater than what it should be. So for SMEs, we need to be considerate that their MRV system should be simplified and not too complicated. And the third thing is, I think it is important to start capacity building exercises across SMEs so that they know, what are the regulations, how they need to record their emissions, etc. So these are the things that need to start now, because in CBAM, maybe in the first phase, SMEs are not included, but going ahead, they may be included in carbon pricing mechanisms globally.
Thank you. And moving on to Mr. Atul Sharma, from a legal perspective, and since there will be a lot of, I would say, litigations also going forward in terms of various measures that between the buyers and suppliers. So how should Indian companies think about regulatory preparedness for CBAM and similar international mechanisms like the UK CBAM, which will follow after the EU CBAM?
So in short, I think the question of compliance and the question of legality are two different questions. So they are not linked to each other because the litigation will be long, will be time consuming, and one may not get the desired result. So the forum basically where this litigation would happen is non-functional typically. But having said that, from a policy perspective, I just had a couple of thoughts, maybe just take forward what Nishtha spoke a couple of minutes earlier. So we talk about CBDR, but what does CBDR or how do we implement CBDR is a question which we don't deeply answer. So Prachi and I explored this question through a very, very short paper about, I think, Prachi, more than a year ago, I think. So let me start with the premise or ask a question to the audience. So when we discuss a subject matter like CBAM in green transition, I am personally of the view there is nothing green about CBAM. It's a plain measure to regain lost competitiveness in manufacturing. environment is a good excuse. And of course, I have my reasons based on the detailed text of CBAM that there is nothing green about it. Green is an excuse, but it is basically, we should be discussing CBAM as a subject matter in forums like neo-colonial trade policies probably is a better suited forum to discuss CBAM. But having said that, so what Prachi and I explored is, if you look at what is the half-life of a carbon dioxide, a molecule, there are various estimates which exist, but one common estimate which we found in a couple of literature, it's about 120 years. So the question which I pose is, does greenhouse gas effect asks an age of the carbon dioxide molecule and then basically manifest itself? If the answer to that question is no, the situation is today that people who have, if environment is a parking lot and CO2 is a car, people who have parked the most cars today have become the gatekeepers, and they want you to pay the tax to park an additional car without vacating the parking lot. No. So what we have argued in that paper is that after you do the CBAM computation, and if you have to implement CBDR principle, of course, India is not equal to Africa, so India can't expect a complete exemption. But what India can very well argue is that if half-life of the carbon dioxide is 120 years, let me introduce another factor to that equation, that whatever is the resultant obligation, you multiply with that country's cumulative emission for 100 years, 120 years, 50 years, and divide by the importing country's total emissions for that corresponding period. By this mechanism, what would happen is there is a calibrated measure, and these adjustment factors are adjusted as you move ahead. So for instance, if India continues to emit more, but climbs up the ladder chain of development, India's this adjustment factor will cumulatively increase. So it's softening the impact. So that's one policy response which we have advocated. There are other policy response which we have advocated, that CBAM contains a provision to claim a deduction of the carbon price. CCTS is not going to be that carbon price. CCTS will only come into picture for a non-compliant unit. A unit which complies with CCTS and attains the objective, it has no deduction to claim in the CBAM equation. So what we have argued is, whatever is the obligation, implement a mirror law, collect that tax at the time of export, and refund it back to the industry for incentives in, let's say, for aluminium, it could be energy storage solutions. For steel, it could be green hydrogen pilot projects. So whatever you collect from that industry, instead of giving a transaction specific rebate, funnel it back into these long-term programs to abate the emissions. So that is another solution which we have talked about very seriously with the government of India. There are a few more solutions in the last round which we have advocated is, yes, of course, there are ISTS projects being developed, interstate distribution or interstate procurement of the renewable power. But what we could do is, as I said, for the reasons which I explain, and I can explain more, CBAM is a underhand law to regain competitiveness. We can have underhand solutions to it. So one solution which we have advocated is, you have massive green capacities coming up in Rajasthan and Gujarat, or any solar project which comes into the country. No mandate that a certain power should go to these hard to abate sectors which are affected by the external regulations. And whatever their captive power produces the power, it's like a barter of the power. So there is a power purchase agreement. You basically facilitate renewable energy transport, and you buy back the captive power plant. The grid has the equal availability of power, but your emission kind of collapses. Probably you clean up these sectors in another year or so. So there are some of these solutions which we have said. The solution will not come from litigation. The solution will come from, of course, our own domestic program and our own domestic timelines to reduce the emissions. but the solutions will certainly not come from the litigation side. Any questions? I'm happy to answer, elaborate more on what I said.
Thank you. Thank you for your, I think, very nicely depicted in terms of some of the key challenges in the problem statement and the answers there. So I think without much ado, I'll move on to Dr. Anil Dhawan, who is the Director General of Steel Proficiency. So Dr. Dhawan, in terms of, especially from the alloy and special steel industry, which is very, very focused and probably it's emerging as a key area for steel sector growth. How is the sector or the segment evaluating the transition towards product level decarbonization, particularly for a CBAM and CCTS perspective? Sharma, you can hear you.
Yeah,
Dr.
Mr. Dhawan, I can't hear. We can't hear you.
Dr. Dhawan, you're on mute, I think.
Dr. Dhawan, we can't hear you. You are on mute.
Yes.
We have unmuted you.
Is it okay?
Yeah, it is okay now.
Okay. Thank you, Rajiv, and thank you, Arpan, for giving this opportunity and bringing us in. While I remember all this started 3 years ago and everybody was talking about two phases. One was transitional phase and the other one definitive phase. I think we are coming nearer to the end of the transitional phase and getting into the definitive phase. We heard the first 2 hours and now into this, and I must thank Mr. Rawat for elaborately telling us to what an integrated steel plant is doing. There are good news, there are bad news. The good news is that steel industry, which has been, I think, identified as one of the most carbon emitting industry, is prepared both in terms of integrated steel plants as well as the others. Let me take half a minute here, Rajiv. We have been talking whole 2 hours exactly in the same language, but then within steel industry, everybody will agree there are 3 types of processes, as one of our he had expressed. That is blast furnace route and electric arc furnace route, leaving aside the induction furnace route. I think the blast furnace route, which has a range of carbon emission of 2.2 to 2.6, and the others is slightly less. Out of these two, the EAF route of steel making is really, we call it a hanging fruit. And I must thank the initiatives which were taken by all the chambers, including FICCI, 2-3 years ago. The race, one of our members, Kalyani Steel, has already taken even the patent for the green steel and are fully prepared for CBAM. Now, when we say fully prepared for CBAM means how many of the steel industry group are capable of doing it. Let me assure you, all the electric arc furnace route people, with all that has been said so far, that means use scrap, use renewable energy, and energy conservation, recycling, etc., it has led to the carbon emission evaluation very low as of now. And in the last 2-3 meetings with CBAM, ECMA, who are the main sectors for us, because one thing I think we missed it is the CBAM is also applicable to the downstream, right? These people will, when they export other items, it becomes applicable there also, the carbon emission. And therefore, the steel that is coming from electric arc furnaces will be already, I'll say, CBAM compliant, because reporting had started 2 years ago. People are already reporting. There were a lot of problems as to nobody knew the formulas which are there as explained by our previous panelists. But consultants, hand-holding by the government, hand-holding by legal firms, including Sarvada with many, has led to a situation, and it is a happy news, that we are mentally prepared. The steel mills are ready to face the CBAM. The question is it only us as exporter
to EU who are getting prepared, there would be others. In fact, I had put one of the questions, how is China prepared? Now, that is something which is not known, that has the competition, is the competition okay once we have prepared ourselves, or the others are better prepared. So for us, those who are into EU exports, it's a very important market for exports. In fact, most of the alloy steels, etc., are being exported either to EU or USA. And USA having put in a lot of problems, so the main focus had to be on EU. And therefore, everything possible has been done to mitigate this risk of losing the market. And therefore, today we have reached a situation, perhaps we are fully confident of saying that it is an opportunity for alloy steel industry, for even the other normal steel industry, that it is a real opportunity for us to make a mark. Here is a big question. Will, and that is where I will request Sarvada's friends to look into whether such a barrier, we call it a non-tariff barrier. Many of us call it a non-tariff barrier. Nothing more. It is not. There's nothing green about it. I fully agree. If it is a non-tariff barrier, there are other barriers also. When you export to EU, it is a quota. It is a beyond quota 25% duty. And as we heard previously, that if the impact is 25% or 15% to 25% for steel, if we can put a regulatory mechanism or a negotiating process with the EU that, okay, you remove the other ones, the anti-dumpings and other quotas, and if this is what is going to be the impact, I can tell you whatever markets have been lost will be regained. We will regain it. Therefore, it cannot be an additive. CBAM should not be an additive impact. It should be only one singular impact. Leave aside other duties. We are all prepared for it. We will answer more questions as we go along. Thank you.
Rajiv, you are on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Dr. Dhawan. I think just to double down on the fact that China, you said China is less dependent on a percentage basis. So, for example, aluminium, India exports almost 25% to EU, China exports 11%. Though in terms of absolute value, it will be higher. Same is for steel. So clearly, I think we also need to learn from what are the other countries, how are they preparing for the CBAM, I would say compliance as well as alignment. Probably I move on to Harsh. So Harsh, if you're there, Harsh Chaudhary, co-founder Centra World. So Harsh, in terms of, since you are also building a lot of solutions around enterprise level emissions intelligence, how is the Indian exporters and especially the diaspora in terms of steel and aluminium and other producers as well, how are they preparing for the enterprise level emission intelligence platforms and preparing for the compliance under CBAM and other global regulations? And what are the challenges that you face, the companies that are facing in operationalization this kind of emission tracking, and how can digital and automation help to overcome this?
Good. Thank you, Rajiv, for the question, and thank you, Fuchi, for having me on this webinar. What I'll do is I'll divide my answer into a few parts, right? I think the first thing that I would like to call out is that, like CBAM, there are about 10 different climate reporting compliances, which just particularly steel companies need to go through. Right? You typically in the voluntary system, there are two types of corporate carbon footprint. There is the GHG protocol one, there's the World Steel Association one. There is now the Green Pro and Green Pro, which are led by CII. There is the CCTS, there is the Green Steel Taxonomy, there is EU CBAM, upcoming there is UK CBAM. There are different forms of PCF, product carbon footprint, that's another ISO. There is life cycle assessment, there is EPD. At some point in time, people have to do BRSR. So at this point in time, if I'm a steel player, I would be, and this is the truth of the matter, and Naveen ji, please say if this is otherwise. But as a steel player, there is generally a lot of commotion. I won't say confusion, but commotion regarding the number of compliances that are there in the market, and which one should they actually follow. So I think that is one thing that steel players need to either have to spend more time on, or leverage experts to get an answer that what is relevant for them and what is not, because even the carbon calculation from each one of them is different, right? If you take the same steel plant and you calculate their emissions by all of these different methodologies, you'll get a different answer. In CCTS, you don't take scope 3 is excluded. In CBAM, as well as the World Steel Association calculation, you don't include transportation. Like that, there are many differences. So the first point to make is, at this point in time, there is generally an overwhelming number of frameworks, calculations, etc. I think this will get even more complex before it gets simpler. I can imagine that there will be 3, 4 more standards. I know UK CBAM, hopefully they'll be a little more rational when it comes out. Hopefully when the Japanese and Korean CBAMs come, they will also be more rational. But there is that point that there are many, but it needs to be distilled together. Steel companies need to realize which ones they want to follow. And I think slowly over time, they are also realizing which ones they want to do. And, it is up to, associations like ASFA, who has been putting their foot forward and trying to explain to their member companies which ones to do. They'll have to continue to do that. That's point number one. That is also connected a little bit to the point number two, that right now what is happening is that any major steel company is allocating, major or minor steel companies also, right? They are allocating like at least 2 people in the team per plant, per site, who are doing only CO2 emissions calculation, reporting, and things like that. That's a massive waste of talent, right? These are all, smart people who have been recruited from, very good engineering colleges, or, accounting courses, right? Whose job is now left to gather data from different sources, get them together, collate them, verify, cross-verify. I mean, this is a waste of talent, right? And this is where I think, Naveenji and I were just at an event right now, and we were talking about this, that how this, it's almost like you're dumbing it down for people. Sorry, just 1 second, there's some background noise of my. Yeah. So I think there is, there is also a little bit of fatigue which is setting in. Earlier, when something is new, people are excited about doing it, and now I think even the analysts who are part of the sustainability functions, they're also getting very, very bored of it. They're like, "What's how many compliances do I need to fill? When can I actually do some work on actual decarbonization?" This is where I think they're resorting to more digital platform like ours and saying that, okay, let's give this off to a digital platform. Let the systems be connected. It's more accurate. It's more comprehensive. And the good part is that, it's the same set of data. Once you have all of that data coming in, you can really take it forward, and you can extract all these reports at the click of a button, right? That's really the second point that I would like to talk about. Then, in addition to that, what is the other trends that we are seeing is that uh, a lot of the steel companies are now moving to a part where they're not only doing this for compliance reporting, but they've realized that I've done that for the last 1 or 2 years. Now we need to think about how we reduce these emissions. So, like CBAM compliance earlier, it was a quarterly calculation, and now it's moving to yearly, right? But now steel companies are realizing that, hey, if I have to reduce my emissions, like I track my production, I track my cost and quality and everything on a day-by-day basis. A lot of companies now want to start their emissions tracking on a day-by-day basis, so that they actually know, was yesterday a good day or not. Because there are so many variables in a steel industry. Typically, to calculate CO2 emissions, there are about 200 variables. Which of these variables has gone up? Which of them has gone down? So how do we instill these things, not just for compliance reporting, but actually we dial it back to talk about how we can actually control this, right? And the last part that I would mention is that we see a few progressive companies who are now making decision-making tools on top of this layer of compliance data. One example is with a Middle Eastern company that we are working with who has fairly low emissions. They are working with us to build a tool where they will select which particular product type, whether it is sections, sheet files, or whatever else. And then they will be able to, for that product on that day, they will be able to see which geography can I profitably sell this in, right? The way that it will work is it will say, okay, fine, I've selected sheet files, and today in let's say I'm in Oman, I'm being able to my cost of production is whatever $700. In that case, it will explore across all the other geographies that you could export to. Are there any import tariffs in those geographies? What is the carbon tax? What is the cost of transport, everything else? And it tells you that, okay, considering all of these are the places that I can export to. So this is just one example where I think everybody is now fairly saturated with this layer of compliance and basic data gathering. They want to improve internally. So get into more of a rigor there. And then secondly, start coming up with some smart decision tools so that you can actually start using this data. And this is something that I would urge our Indian, I know that the larger companies like a JSPL or a GSW are well on their way, but I think it's the smaller companies who are still exporting and who's still part of the climate, the green steel topic, right? Who should start looking at, we've always been talking about how to convert this into an opportunity. I think now's the time. I think it's time that steel companies quickly close out their whole compliance part and start working on the opportunity creation part, leverage your data to be able to do that.
So, yeah, I think Harsh, well said. One question I had is from an opportunity perspective. So there's a term called cooperation or collaboration, rather, collaboration between competitors. So do you think this can be a perfect platform for collaboration between different steel companies? Because we are seeing from a global standpoint, even in the globally mining companies like BHP as well as BO or some of the steel companies, they're collaborating towards transition.
Yeah, I couldn't understand the whole question, but I'm guessing that you are asking that how can steel companies now think about collaborating
Yes.
to capture this opportunity? See, my one example of collaboration, again, I allude to a conversation that Naveen ji and myself and a couple of other people were having this week. The whole topic of green steel premium, right? This has to happen, right? We are talking, I mean, there are two sides to this premium. One is an avoided CO2 tax, right? If you have low CO2 emissions, you can export to, let's say, Europe, and then what you have is you have the ability to increase your margins because your CO2 emissions are low, you become globally more competitive, right? So it's directly affecting your margin. That's one. The other one is where there is no compliance system or a carbon tax, you start to think about green steel premium. For me, it is becoming very clear that, and I think, other people resonate with it. We have to think of a world where carbon or low CO2 is being appreciated. And honestly, in business, there's only one form of appreciation, right? Which is monetary, right? So we also need to ensure that the same language, the same tone is being passed on to buyers of steel. If individual steel companies just come up with, we see about, so many green steel brands coming up, which are moving towards the point that, we'll sell green steel, let's see how much the orders are, what premiums we will get. And I'm definitely not saying there should be any price fixing, but I think there needs to be a broad alignment to say what is a green steel premium. If you're reducing by 1 ton of CO2 per ton of steel compared to your next best alternative, there has to be a premium associated with it, right? And the premium will get sharper. All I would say at this point is that, like we have put down a taxonomy for the CO2 emissions level, there also needs to be some sort of a taxonomy or an understanding which can lend some structure into green steel premiums. If I give you an example right now, the real estate sector, there are 10 big real estate companies in India who have claimed a net zero target. And I have now spoken to each one of them. It all sounds very nice that we need to reduce our CO2 emissions. Steel forms 30% of our embodied emissions. Let's go out and reduce it. But when you start talking about a premium, then the whole debate falls through because they're like, oh, procurement won't agree and all of that. The whole point is that that needs to come top down. Companies need to realize, buyers of steel need to develop something called an ICP, an internal carbon price, so that they have the formal structure to accept a premium. So Rajiv, to your question, the one thing that I would say should be something which is a topic of collaboration is to work together to frame or to have a framework to start thinking about a green steel premium. Maybe it's an ICP, an internal carbon price that buyers need to set in place or something of that nature.
Thank you so much. So maybe at the next round of discussions and the panelists, so focusing on what are the action items for the industry as well as the government from a policy standpoint. I move on to Mr. Naveen Allawa. Naveenji, just to understand from your perspective, how we're addressing the cost competitiveness gap between the green steel and the conventional steel, considering regulations like CBAM. But more importantly, if you can talk about 2 or 3 areas where the government can play a role in terms of policy, and a couple of areas where industry should come forward, or the industry should enact upon.
Thanks, Rajiv, for the question. I think government is playing a role, but I think I will tell you how they are playing the role as if on the as is scenario. First is about bringing the viability gap funding in promoting coal gasification is one of them, and also on the low carbon emission side, I think there are basically support the viability gap funding that has been given on a pilot scale, but again pilot to semi-commercial scale. On the 2B basis, I think what can be done, and the third point on the as is basis is about the mandates. This green steel taxonomy that has come in, I think it is the first time in the world any country has tried to define what is green steel via the various star ratings, the carbon intensity, right? So I think that is a right step, or I would say the right base to start with, and it can keep on bettering every day. This is not the ultimate definition, or this is not where we are going to converge forever. It is a dynamic process. It is going to evolve on daily basis, right? So this is on the as is scenario. I think this is a very good start to have. 2B basis, I think there are so many things that we need to do. First is how we can sort of up to pilot 5 tons per day, hydrogen, or 10 tons per day is not going to solve the purpose. We need gigawatts. So if you talk about, by 2030, we need to add 5 million tons of green hydrogen. That is equivalent to putting up 125 gigawatt of renewable energy and close to, basically 25 gigawatt of basic electrolyzers. So it is a mammoth task, right? So now what we need to be done is how we can scale up, basically this technology. And there, I think government has to bring in the PLI, the VG of the viability gap funding at a much scalable level. Because, if we don't seize this opportunity, then in next 2 to 3 years, there will be global, I'm talking about in India, there will be, after 2-3 years, there will be so many plants, commercial plants coming up, globally. Stegra is going to commission the first battery by end of next year. Then there will be Volkswagen, then SSAB, LCAB is also planning. So these guys are going to put the plant. So in India, we need to sort of bring this viability gap funding and PLI. And I think the next point where the government has to really pitch in is about, I think, the R&D activities. There is, the activities has already started. There is a good interface. There is a good alignment that is happening between the industry and academia. But it has to be, the academia has to also sort of step up, in terms of the result-oriented, the target-oriented research. That we cannot keep it open-ended. It is a time now, because time is an essence, and we need to bring all these things on the ground ASAP. So I think that is important. The last point is about how we manage this talent management, the human capital. I think the training becomes very, very important, and that is where I think we need some policies where the training and this thing can be sort of supported by the government. I think these are some of the factors on the as is and to be has to be done in the short to medium time, and then I think the industry, once that is done, and the mandates have already come in. If you talk about as is scenario, the mandate, the green steel low carbon emission mandates, like for a 3-star, it is 20%, 4-star it is 5%, and 1% is for 5-star. So these mandates have come. I think that will really motivate integrated steel players like us to really do this transition. So I think on the 2B cases, I think all those actions, all the support has to come at a much more accelerated, manner. So these are
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Naveen. Prachi and Dr. Dhawan, same questions to you. What are the 2 or 3 action points from a policy side which you would like the government to take? And then what would be the 2 actions from an industry or the sector or subsector that you are working in? Maybe I'll start with Prachi, followed by.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. First and foremost, I think we have not, when we come to the hand holding with the government or what the policy should be, I think the policy of the government has to get into the demand creation. Unless there are scales for a green steel or a steel with a low carbon emission made mandatory at certain levels, the demand will not come. Demand will not come. There will be no scale. If there is no scale, then automatically everything will become theoretical. Second, the CBAM collection, I think if the formula, if we have understood that whatever CBAM taxes are there, if they are collected in the country of region of the goods, then that amount will be deducted. I think we should start our process immediately so that those amounts which are collected, if at all, they are utilized in schemes like PLI, as Mr. Alawat mentioned, or R&D activities for enhancing capability of low carbon emission steel. Of course, 2 more issues I wanted to mention. There is a lot of thrust and talk about renewable energy to be used more to bring down the emissions. But on the ground, when it comes to distribution, it comes to policy for power, there is absolutely no priority for steel sector as of now. I don't know for aluminium if there is any. In fact, we are fighting a case in Maharashtra where even the banking facilities have been withdrawn, and whatever you produce in peak hour, you expend. So I think energy sector has to support such high carbon emitting sectors like steel to make policy so that whatever is produced is not only banked, but it is given more from solar, from hydro to this sector. Thirdly, the scrap. Everybody feels that if the higher quantity of scrap is used, naturally the carbon emissions will come down. But scrap shortage and the scrap deficit in the country has to be supplemented with a scrappage policy, which I think is not in the priority anywhere. So these are the 4-5 things. And as far as the industry is concerned, industry on its own, as we have been discussing, is very keen to develop low carbon emission steels through its own resources, through hand holding, and even collaborations. We can put it up. Many of our units have joined collaborations with Japanese, Korean companies to have technology in such a manner that the net carbon emission is low.
Thank you. Thank you. Prachi, the same question to you as well.
Yeah. I think I'll make 3 quick points. One is related to the issue, and I'll build on what Atul said. One is related to the issue of fragmented carbon markets, which is more of a global issue. Second is related to, domestically what we can do in terms of streamlining of domestic carbon, multiplicity of taxes, I think, which one of the panelists pointed about. And third would be on the funding part. So if I, on the first part on the issue of fragmented carbon markets, I think in October 24, there was a joint report by multilateral agencies, IMF, World Bank, UNCTAD, WTO, OECD had put together a report in the World Economic Forum referring to greater collaboration with respect to carbon markets and pricing. And I think one important message it delivered was that if CBAM is taken alone without any spillover effects, negative or positive, then it would deliver only a modest contribution to reducing GHG emissions, 0.3%. I think all of us here, while we are, talking about technical details, reporting, etc., the larger point is that the goal is net zero, the goal is carbon reduction, and it highlighted that unless it really triggers more ambitious climate policies elsewhere in global south or other developing countries, the impact could be negligible. It also said that if it leads to further policy fragmentation and more trade tensions or potential negative impact, then it could be even lesser. Now, building on to what Atul said, the principle of CBDR and even Nishita pointed out, carbon pricing is a real issue because the EU ETS was set up in 2004 or 5, and the carbon pricing has moved to a certain level, 70-80 euros, expected to go to maybe 100, 110, 120 when it actually CBAM comes into the picture. India would nowhere be there. So, as far as adjustments, and Atul also said, depends on obligated or non-obligated entity. So IMF in a paper in 2021 had actually spoken about it way too early. It said that carbon pricing is a very good tool if used effectively, and how a CBDR principle can actually be implemented. So it talked about a tiered approach to carbon pricing, where it said, maybe it talked about a flat structure. It said maybe high income countries can have a carbon price floor of $75 per ton, middle income at 50, and low income countries at $25. Even if we don't take that approach because it's a very flat tiered structure, how about a carbon pricing framework based on purchasing power parity basis, because that's basic economics. And that is how you can put CBDR principle into practice. Now, the point is, given the global trade landscape today, will countries, and given US's stance on Paris Agreement and climate policies, will the world come together to do this? The answer is no. Is it practically possible? No. However, can we embed this kind of approach in an India-EU FTA, the ongoing negotiations that are going on? Probably yes. So, I mean, this could be one of the answers, because ultimately a fragmented carbon market globally or even in India will not work. This brings us to the second question on streamlining of domestic carbon taxes. Our internal calculations tell us, in case of aluminium, I don't know about steel, is that if we put all the implicit carbon taxes together, because CCTS is still in the elementary stage, we've just received our targets for primary and secondary sectors. If we put together all of this, we pay around $15 per ton of CO2 as carbon taxes. This includes some of the taxes which, like coal cess, which are now called GST compensation cess. RPO is, the trajectory is much higher. So if we put everything together, it'll be around $15-16, including fuel taxes. And of course, if we add the TS to it, it will be around $20-25. So my point is, carbon in India is not free. And I think that's the point we the Indian government would want to emphasize to the European Union, that the Indian industry is already paying a carbon tax even much before the CCTS was rolled out. That is one. But if we could streamline all of these taxes, and actually, I don't think Indian industry will have a problem if much stricter targets under the CCTS are given than which are rolled out today. However, these multiplicity of taxes that are present are, that compliance for so many taxes that the Indian industry has to do, and then pay, and then see, what are the pros and cons. They are removed, and, like one nation, one carbon tax. And then that could be the number you could showcase that the industry is paying. And the third follow-up to this is, when you are actually paying these taxes, please learn from the EU. What the EU did, please realize, Mario Draghi, in his report last September, pointed out about how over-regulation is killing EU. He's the, former president of European Commission. And he highlighted that, these green regulations are part of it. But what the EU has done right is that today they are saying all the revenue of CBAM will be collected, will be used for funding exporters, because, to prevent carbon leakage outside. So clearly the intent is that I collect money from you, keep it and use it for my own producers. Why don't we collect all these carbon taxes in a decarbonization fund or a green transition fund, whatever you may choose to call it, and then use for, as the steel industry people also suggested, use for decarbonization of industry. It should be MSMEs rather. because I think the larger players can still do it, afford to do it, but the smaller players will not be able to do it. So I think these are the three things that the government could quickly implement.
Thanks, Prachi. Thanks for the pointers that you mentioned. From an enabler perspective, I think there are three different angles. One is, of course, technology. The second is legal enablers for the industry to thrive in a post-CBAM environment, and of course, the policy environment. So if I go to first, Atul, from a legal enabler point of view, what would be the 2 or 3 interventions? Very brief, maybe 30 seconds. What are the enablers from a legal standpoint?
Yeah. So, as I said, the first enabler would be a law which will say that whatever is your CBAM declaration, file a copy with the shipping bill before the Indian customs, discharge the tax as per the EU formula, collect it and distribute it. I think that should be the first enabler. Part of this law should also be, Mr. Dhawan pointed out, that we don't know where our competitors are in terms of emission. So, and similarly, MSMEs need to know the upstream emission. So one of my, 2 years ago, I had made a suggestion that when you implement this tax on export, also mandate that all steel, aluminium entering into the country should also file a copy of their declaration with the Indian customs. And we can publish it anonymized tables. So like the country tables. No, of course, we didn't had a chance to discuss the impact of these country tables on default value. But by this regulation, we would collect data on all the steel and aluminium which is entering into the country. So where our competitors stand, HSN code wise, we'll be able to ascertain. So this should be part of a single package, a very, very low hanging fruit, which we should do. Second, I am not in favor of going all in on this concept, because if you put it in the larger perspective, we are sitting at 100 million ton of steel production, where exports are about 6 to 7 million tons or maybe 8 million tons this year. No, there are steep costs which will, so our chief economic advisor at multiple CBAM forums, he said there is another impossible trinity in play, that we can choose only 2 out of the 3: economic growth, net zero, or fiscal prudence. So we can't achieve all 3 together. So we have to be prudent. We have to be targeted to providing relief for exports and maintaining competitiveness, rather than going whole hog that increase the total cost of production of 100 million tons of steel into India and 4 million tons of aluminum into India. So that any regulatory intervention has to be targeted. It can't be horizontal. That would be, I would say, a template to develop a good policy to withstand these instruments.
Thank you, Atul. The same question from a technology standpoint, Harsh.
Yeah. So I think the things that I think the actions are more required on the steel companies than policy or government. Sorry, was the question more around what needs to happen at the policy level, or what individuals companies
My
need to
question
do?
was 3 enablers, one from a legal standpoint, one from a technology, one from a policy standpoint. So from a technology standpoint, what would be the 2 or 3 actions from an industry that industry should look at in the future? Of course, people are looking at capturing emissions, but you mentioned about some of these enablers, but probably one.
Yeah, sure. So I think, this is the time that you need to get your house in order as far as your data is concerned, right? I mean, most steel companies today and aluminum companies today do have an ERP. They have an SAP or a Lighthouse, or in some cases, some of them even have a Tally or something, right? Uh, Ensure that your data is all there. You're calculating emissions at a monthly level, if not a heat by heat level. So one is invest into the right data systems, the right platforms to ensure that your CO2 emissions are being calculated from the right frame. The second one, extending the whole logic of technology, is going to be able to merge dollars with tons of CO2. Right? We cannot live in this isolated world where our analytics are only on our sustainability team is only concerned with tons of CO2 here and there. but we need to bring the dollar part into the equation, and a lot of modeling really needs to go into that. That would be number two. And number three, from a technology standpoint, I would say that start simulating journeys. Start simulating your low carbon futures. I mean, there are so many decarbonization opportunities out there, be it H2DRI, be it scrap, be it renewable power. So start simulating these journeys and get the most out of your data. I'm not even touching on AI right now because I think there is still time to move ahead, and that topic has been beaten to death anyway. Right. So I would say those are the three things: get your house in order with your data systems, start talking in dollars per ton of CO2 and all of that, rather than just CO2. And the third one is start running simulations on your low carbon growth futures.
Thank you. Thank you. Nishtha, probably your last panelist to talk about 2 or 3 enablers from a policy standpoint.
One thing that I want to say is that Asia Society Policy Institute conducted an EU ETS study tour in May, where we went and met EU industry and DG Klima, DG Taxit on, what they're doing with EU ETS, what are the developments in CBAM, etc. And one thing that I think is important is when we adopt a policy, we need to understand what are the different dimensions of it and then accommodate it in our policy. So a key point with EU ETS was that the power sector was included, and the auction, the allowances that were auctioned, the money was redirected back to industry. So there is innovation fund, there's modernization fund, and that's what Prachi was saying, that if Indian industry is already paying $15 per ton of CO2, it should come back to industry to decarbonize. So I think one thing is that, to understand that, yes, there's CBAM, but if as a response to CBAM, we have CCTS, then how do we actually leverage that tool to our benefit? And that would include, creating revenue, generating revenue from this system, and helping industry, including SMEs, industry, as well as, just transition. So I think there is a need to understand the potential of CCTS and policies like that to the fullest. That is the first. And then the second thing is, so for example, the finance ministry came out with draft taxonomy for climate transition finance. So we need something similar so that this finance could be directed towards these efforts. So I think these are the two key things that I would want to say, that implementation of a policy to leverage its full potential is one, and that can be done by understanding what it can possibly do. And second is that defining the objectives, which is not clear right now. So right now we don't have defined objective that this is what we want to do. So yeah, these are the 2 points that I would want to highlight.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I think panelists, thank you for your time. I think it's been a pleasure, and a lot of insights came around policies, around technology, around legal aspects, around the industry readiness, and I would say some of the other supporting infrastructure needed. So thank you so much. Arpan, maybe we'll have a couple of questions, or we kind of close the session because already we are 9 minutes over the
maybe
session.
you can take just one or two which are there in the chat box. I think there is one that has come up in terms of the other sectors. While that's not part of the CBAM, but maybe you can just have a quick this thing for a couple of minutes max.
Right. So we was not able to open the chat box. The chat box. Can somebody? Yeah. So there's some questions around. I think this probably one question is around. There's a lot of questions around gasification. One question is to everybody, like while CBAM focuses heavily on emissions from core industrial processes like steel and aluminum, I would like to ask about an overlooked contributor, industrial garments. I think this is some garments point of view, and
I think there are a couple of questions which one talks about when they are talking about the garment sector, which initially is not part of the CBAM scope, and the other is talking about in terms of the water and all those kind of things, the wastewaters and all those, which could be one of the things. So if any panelists would like to answer on that, I think garment is not part of the scope as of now for the CBAM, and there is no this thing. So we can obviously work as an Indian industry in terms of their transition towards green. But maybe the panelists would like to highlight on that, anything on those garment sector and the waste water management and all, how that can help in transitioning towards green, the toxic waters and all. Any panelists would like to answer those?
Maybe I think then one question that is good is how is Bangladesh and some of the other countries, maybe like China, they are doing in terms of emission control. That is also one question that from my side. What are the learnings that we have from those countries?
So global best practices or the learnings.
Yes.
Archie, would you like to answer that? The global learnings, the global best practices.
Arpan, can you please repeat the question? Sorry, not able to hear properly.
So there are two questions primarily. So one is that what are those global best practices or learnings in terms of like other countries are doing, maybe like Bangladesh or someone who is also into a developing phase. So what are they doing and what can be learned from the other peers around us, other developing nations like us? And secondly, the waste waters and the wastewater management, toxic waters and all, will that also be counted into CBAM or not?
I think maybe I can attempt the first one. About the best practices on the decarbonization. I think the practices are already in bit. If you talk about the uses of let's say the blending of bioethanol in petrol, right, in gasoline. So we have already achieved 20% blending. And I think the aim is not to stop here. The aim is to further increase it to 40%. And this learning has come directly from our basically BRIC nation, that is from Brazil, right? And this is actually one of the important step as well, one of the enabler, if we have to also sort of use the captured CO2 and make ethanol out of it for our industrial gases as well. And that has been also included as part of as one of the way to make ethanol. So I think this is a very good a learning, and it can be a good sort of a supply and demand. There is definitely going to be a supply. One is like about supply coming from 1G, 2G, but from industrial gases also, it can be a very good enabler or one of the best use case for captured CO2 into ethanol because the demand is already there. So that's one. The second practice is coming directly from China, is about how we can sort of maximize the uses of renewable energy, because China has more or less mastered this deployment of renewable energy across all their operation, and also the valorization of the waste gases like the coke oven gases, the blast furnaces, the BOF gases, and how we can sort of valorize this and try to make more power or more chemical out of these gases. I think that is also the learning, and some of the integrated steel producers, they've already started using that. Renewable energy is a no-brainer at this point of time, because whatever you do in maximizing in renewable energy is you are in the money at as we speak. So I think these are the two practices that we clearly see, and also the use of biomass as well. I think in the power sector it is already mandatory 5%. We are already mixing it, and I think steel sector also, depending upon the switching cost in the blast furnaces and in the electric arc furnaces. At this point of time, the cost is the switching cost is very high. But as we move forward, when the availability of the biomass is there, we sort of optimize and streamline the inbound logistics around the supply of biomass. And the moment we start hitting 70, 56, 50 to $70 per ton, I think then, it become absolutely basically a very good use case to maximize the biomass at the mass scale, across the steel sector. So I think these are the three things that I can say right away. Dhawanji, you want to add on the zero liquid discharge?
Dr. Dhawan, if you can highlight on that whether water emissions we are part of the emissions counted under CBAM, under any scope. I mean, to the experts on that, will water emissions be part of the CBAM regulation as well? Dr. Dhawan,
I think water emission is not there, but I think as an integrated steel producer, I think we have to sort of the water use, deployment of the zero liquid discharge, and also how you can try to conserve and be water surplus positive. I think that is where the focus is. So I think across all the plants, and as we move forward, there are definitely the push, the nudge coming from the State Pollution Control Board and also from the CPCB. And I think it is also, everything that is going waste in the steel plant. I think gone are the days where we just we can shy away and we can just put basically turn our eyes basically toward those incidents. But I think at this point of time, anything that is going waste, I think converting, try to reuse it and try to sort of valorize it. I think that is definitely one of the important sort of lever to decarbonize, and also not about the decarbonize, circular, bringing bringing circularity, and also converting this waste into wealth. So I think this is definitely one of the things. And in across all our BRSR reports, we definitely we mention about it, how much water has been preserved, how much water we have sort of spared, and how we are water positive in terms of deployment of ZLD. So this is definitely one of the use cases.
Sure, thank you. While there are a lot of questions which are there in the chat box, but I believe we can keep it, park them for the next
I think
webinar.
one of the question, Arpan, that was asked is about what are the strategies for the sponge, I think sponge iron steel makers, the SMEs. I think we are actually in Raipur as we speak. So I think one of the important lever, maybe just to answer that question, is that we have identified is basically forming the clusters of the deployment of the renewable energy. This is the most easiest low-hanging fruit, and I think that is where we are actually proposing that if we can make clusters around Raipur, Jalna, and all the tier 2, tier 3 cities where these hubs are there, sponge iron hubs are there, this can be one of the way how we can start sort of reducing the carbon intensity. That's one. Second, how we can repurpose the existing setup, because repurposing is super important. Replacement cost, because some of the plants are as fresh. If we talk about the blast furnaces in India, they are very young blast furnaces, 12 to 14 odd years, right? So I think the replacement cost is very high. So how we can repurpose it, like in the conventional rotary kilns, how we can sort of use hydrogen. And one of the plant has been recently commissioned in Namibia by a company called Hire. So I think that the learnings can come from there, and how we can sort of retrofit and repurpose the existing asset. That is definitely the key as we move forward.
Sure.
Thank you. I think Arpan, we are already 15 minutes over the scheduled time, so we may close the session.
Yeah.
Thank you, panelists, for your insights, and really wonderful to hear from all of you. This is an extremely enriching session, and some of these actions, what we'll do is we'll have captured that as a part of the discussion. We'll kind of share a post-event document for the government as well from a policy angle.
Sure.
Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Rajiv, for moderating the diversified panel that we had. And thank you all the panelists for joining us and sharing your expert insights with us, particularly on the last portion where we had certain recommendations. So we will submit that to the government and to other stakeholders for their perusal. One thing I wanted to say was that, there's a lot of enthusiasm on the subject and interest, and we have received a lot of questions. So maybe we can park them for the next round, wherein we are going to have a collaborative dialogue with the EU counterparts being there. We are planning for that in the second half of September, wherein again a webinar kind of mode would be adopted, and we will have EU participation also into the program, so that we can hear their perspective also and have a more of an interactive dialogue with them. So with this particular note, I would like to just put across my vote of thanks for the entire program. I convey my sincere thanks to all the panelists, the moderators from Deloitte team, all the speakers in the opening session for joining us today, sharing their insights with us, and also to the audience that we have. We had more than 200 participants in the program. That shows the kind of interest and enthusiasm in the subject. That shows the importance of the subject. And with each one's contribution, whether it's a panelist or the program, we were able to pull off the objectives which we had envisaged when we conceived this program, when we conceived this webinar. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this particular thought-provoking brainstorming webinar on CBAM. Particularly when we are talking about in the context of steel and aluminum industries, which are in the transitional phase. As has been discussed during the last 3 hours, CBAM as a kind of a policy instrument is there. We cannot avoid it. We cannot ignore it. And it poses significant challenges in terms of the carbon taxes, in terms of the competitiveness. But it is also kind of an opportunity for us to how we can navigate through this particular phase, how we can come out as an true champion of decarbonization and green, and how we can ensure that our competitiveness remains strong, as has been while we are looking at the CBAM regulation. Also, as was discussed, that there are other nations like UK CBAM, like Norway and US thinking of following suit with these kind of regulations. So we need to ensure that there is no rerouting of exports from other countries under FTA mode, specifically like China and all. and the ASEAN FTA. It is very important that there is a level playing field for the Indian producers, and that was our objective of creating this platform, so that we can discuss that what is required from a policy perspective, what is required from an industry perspective in terms of technology, in terms of MRV, that we are able to remain, we are able to continue with our market position that we have in terms of the EU exports. We have accordingly crafted today's sessions. We have accordingly had the presentations on the MRV, onto the simplifications, onto the tech solutions available. And therefore, I would like to thank all the participants, including the panelists, the delegates who have joined us today. My special mention also for the Ministry of Steel and Niti Aayog for their support that they have extended. Also thanking our sponsors who have supported the program, media friends who were there joining us via YouTube channels as well, and our knowledge partner Deloitte for their continuous support in building this program. As we move forward, as I mentioned, the second edition of the series would be in the second half of September. We would be sharing the date soon with you, and we look forward to for you all to join us for that particular webinar also, where we will have the EU counterparts with us. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting us in this endeavor, and we look forward to continue this momentum on the CBAM subject, taking the insights and discussions forward. So thank you all the panelists, thank you all the participants, thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you and
Thank
good
you so
night.
much.
Thank you everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Arpan.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.